disclaimer. The crime that I'm going to be talking about in this week's episode happened between the early 1980s and 2005. However, the perpetrator in this case has more recently come out as a transgender woman. Now, we always try and tell these stories in real time, like how it happened in the moment for the victim, for their loved ones, or for investigators, but we are also really mindful of the struggles of the transgender community that they face every single day, especially in the media. So although we're going to be telling the story as it unfolded, we will be using gender-neutral pronouns when referencing this person to avoid using her dead name as much as possible. And if the term dead name is totally new to you, or you're suddenly realizing that maybe you don't know as much as you'd like to about the issue facing transgender people, we're actually going to include some links in the show notes for today's episode that will hopefully be pretty helpful. And also, before anyone gets quick with the 1-star review button because we're being too woke or PC because you don't think a person who committed a violent crime deserves all of the care that we put into this episode, honestly, it's too early in the morning for that.
Yeah, like, you're taking shots at me like it's Patron, and I'm just like, damn. It's 7 a.m. And honestly, yes, guys, it pretty much is.
Yeah, but listen, it's not about them. My words, Brit's words, your words hold a lot of power. And there is an entire community of wonderful people who can be harmed if we all aren't careful with our words. So it's about, to be honest, like there's no broken glass anywhere and Mary Lynn's car wasn't there. So at first, I think any normal person would probably be thinking that maybe she'd just gone somewhere on her own.
Except it's a school day, and that would have been completely unlike her.
Right. So her daughter Jane is panicked, and she's feeling really helpless because she lives 3 hours away from Charleston, so she can't even go over herself and just hop over to the house to see if there's anything wrong or look for her mother. So her mind is just jumping to all kinds of conclusions. So Jane and her husband get in the car and start heading to Charleston to get answers for themselves. But along the way, they contact police to report Mary Lynn missing. And luckily, this isn't one of those cases where police tell them to wait 24 hours or something like that.
Thank goodness.
They get to work immediately, and Jane actually gives them permission to enter Mary Lynn's home by force while she makes her way there. And that's what they do. Now, although Mary Lynn's colleagues didn't notice anything wrong when they checked the outside of the house, as soon as police enter, they come to a totally different conclusion. Because according to an Associated Press report published by the Item, when police enter, the house seems off. For example, they notice jewelry on the floor, as well as an apple, plus some food in the kitchen that looks like it was kind of just left there mid-meal. As they continue searching the property, they notice a broken spindle on a staircase leading up to the second floor. So that's where they head next, following this trail upstairs into Mary Lynn's bedroom. And when they walk in, that's when they really know something bad happened here. They see drawers are open. Things have been rifled through, and there are clothes all over the floor.
So basically, the place had been ransacked.
Pretty much. I mean, maybe you could look at it as if Mary Lynn had just left in a panic or something, but if that's what police are thinking, that theory is proven wrong as soon as they enter the second floor bathroom, because that is where they find Mary Lynn, dead in her bathtub. Now, obviously, this has immediately become a completely different situation for police. They're looking at a potential homicide now. So they get right to work processing the scene, and Mary Lynn's body is sent off for autopsy, where they find that her cause of death was strangulation. The results also note that she had been sexually assaulted and that her hands and feet had been bound with tape. Now, as soon as Mary Lynn's family learns what happened, they immediately point police in the direction of someone who they think could be responsible for her murder. And that person is Edmonds Tennant Brown IV, who we'll be referring to as Brown from here on out.
Okay, so who is this person?
Well, to answer that question, we kind of need to jump back a little bit. And I'm not talking just a few months here. We actually need to go all the way back to 1981. Back then, Mary Lynn was a single mom of one, just coming out of a painful, messy divorce. But she definitely didn't lack for interested men. In Keith Morrison's piece for NBC News, a family friend says that she had to basically beat off potential suitors with a stick, which maybe is to be expected considering this lady was a catch. Mary Lynn was super smart. She had become a really popular teacher. Parents, students, colleagues, pretty much everyone loved her. And on top of all of that, she had even won beauty pageants in the past.
Okay, so this lady is the total package.
Yeah. But one particular man caught her attention, and that was Edmund's Kenneth Brown III. He was a single parent too. He had 2 children, and he came from a really prominent family in Charleston. And as you might expect, Edmunds and Mary Lynn were absolutely smitten with one another. And Edmunds also adored Mary Lynn's daughter Jane and really doted on her. In an interview with NBC News, Jane says that he would actually come over in the mornings after Mary Lynn had gone to work and would make Jane's breakfast for her and take her to school.
Okay, that is A+ boyfriend material.
Totally. But their relationship wasn't quite as picture perfect as you might expect. Because although Edmunds welcomed Jane with open arms, things didn't go quite as smoothly with his 2 children. A 9-year-old daughter named Molly and his oldest child, a 10-year-old named Brown, who I mentioned before.
You mean like Mary Lynn wasn't welcoming to them?
No, the source material on this case all indicates that Mary Lynn was very good with Molly and Brown, but there were a couple of issues on the kids' part, really. One of the issues was that Molly and Brown seemed to be quite jealous of the attention Edmunds gave Mary Lynn's daughter, which I can totally see. That kind of a big change is really tough for a kid.
Oh, for sure.
But despite that, Brown really seemed to like Mary Lynn, and to her credit, she tried really hard to look past all the awkwardness and try to build a relationship with them. And remember, Mary Lynn was a teacher. She knew how to connect with kids, even challenging ones, and Brown was a little challenging. The source material is a little vague on this, but Brown is mostly described as awkward, someone who wanted to fit in but just didn't. So again, coming from a background of teaching, Mary Lynn had encountered kids like this before, and she wanted so badly to be there for Brown. But there were a few incidents early on in Mary Lynn and Edmund's relationship that definitely made this more difficult.
Like what?
Well, according to an episode of Obsession, Dark Desires that covered this case, Brown would occasionally steal some of Mary Lynn's things, particularly her clothes and jewelry. And actually, Mary Lynn initially thought it was her daughter, Jane, who had been taking them. But Jane actually caught Brown wearing these items at least once, so it definitely created some tension. But the most troubling incident happened one day when Mary Lynn and Edmunds had the kids at the country club pool. At one point, Mary Lynn and Edmunds were sitting by the pool watching their kids play. And Brown was like, "Hey Jane, let's see who can hold their breath the longest." So Jane takes a deep breath and ducks under the surface. But Brown didn't join her. Instead, they placed their hands on Jane's head and calmly held her below the water. Luckily, Mary Lynn noticed this happening and was able to rescue Jane before anything truly terrible happened. And the thing about this is, it wasn't even really the act itself that disturbed Mary Lynn. She knew better than anyone that sometimes kids do stupid and dangerous things.
Right.
What really struck Mary Lynn was how Brown reacted afterward. How completely calm they were. They had no remorse whatsoever for what they'd done.
Yeah, that would be chilling.
Right? But they all moved on from that, and Mary Lynn and Edmund stayed together for a few more years. And there aren't a ton of details about what Brown's behavior was like during this time. It's definitely implied that things were still awkward, but just nothing as serious as the swimming pool incident. But either way, Mary Lynn just was never really comfortable with how their 2 families were blending. And so in 1988, despite Edmunds having proposed to her multiple times, Mary Lynn decided that it would be best for her and Jane if she ended her relationship with Edmunds. And look, breakups are hard, especially with long-term relationships.
Well, and also with long-term relationships with kids.
Kids, right, yeah. So I'm sure this was a difficult time for everybody. But the person who seemed to have the most trouble letting go wasn't Mary Lynn or Edmunds, it actually was Brown. It was after Mary Lynn and Edmunds broke up that Brown started just showing up at Mary Lynn's house. Basically just kind of standing on her porch, or they might ride their bicycle to her house. And like you said, breakups can be really tough on kids for sure. And so the first few times it happened, Mary Lynn would kind of engage with Brown, hey, how you doing? Do you want to talk? That kind of thing. But it kept happening to the point where Mary Lynn was noticing Brown watching her about every day.
And how old would Brown have been at this point? Early teens-ish, or?
No, by this point, Brown would have been 18 years old.
Oh, so, pretty much a full-grown adult.
Yeah, and look, it's not like them showing up could have been something that was explained away, like, oh, maybe Brown is just riding through the neighborhood a lot or something like that. I mean, first of all, it's the frequency of it. This was happening pretty much every day. But also, there was a period where Marilyn and Jane had actually moved away from Charleston temporarily. Now, I don't know what led to the move. Like, in this case, I don't believe it was like their attempt to get away from Brown's creepy behavior, but they relocated to a place called Mount Pleasant, which isn't far from Charleston, maybe like 15, 20 minutes away, but not like on Brown's route, right, to and from school. But still, Brown was showing up there too.
And did Marilyn ever report it to the police? At this point, at least, I feel like it's straight up stalking.
She didn't know, which is not uncommon, to be honest. And I think one of the big issues is that stalking is not like other crimes against people, like assault, for example, that is really clear cut. Everyone knows exactly what it is. Everyone knows it's a crime. Stalking is different. What stalking is, the actual definition, just isn't as well known or understood.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking, is there an actual definition for stalking? Because I certainly don't know it.
Well, that's the thing. Legally, it actually varies from place to place. But while we were putting together this episode, we spoke with SPARK, which is the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. And they say that a good definition of stalking is, quote, a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear, end quote.
Okay, so that definitely feels like it would apply in this situation.
Absolutely. But I still get where Marilyn is coming from in this situation, too, with not calling the cops. Here's the thing, too. It's not like it's a stranger that she's dealing with. This was someone who was basically a part of her family for years. And her daughter, Jane, told Keith Morrison with NBC News that at the time, she and Mary Lynn didn't even really think there was a crime being committed. I also can't help but think that maybe Mary Lynn saw Brown as, right, this sort of misfit. We said before they were awkward. And so she probably was like empathizing with them.
Right, and I mean, she knew Brown as a kid and essentially watched them grow up. It would be really hard to see them as anything else than like just a kid. Mm-hmm. Not to mention, as a kid, I'm sure she felt like Brown was harmless, and even that kind of idea like, yeah, they're creepy and I hate it, but they're harmless. That would be really hard to kind of get your mind past.
Right, because she knew them. But honestly, knowing your stalker is also really common. In fact, the majority of victims are stalked by someone they know, whether that be an acquaintance or a former partner. So what Mary Lynn was experiencing with Brown, while she maybe couldn't see it herself, was pretty much a textbook case of stalking. But it didn't stop at just creepy visits. About a year after breaking things off with Edmonds, Mary Lynn had taken a trip to visit her mother, who lived a few hours away from Charleston. The two went for a walk, and when they returned to Mary Lynn's mother's house, it was clear that someone had broken in. Now, there was nothing missing, or at least it didn't seem like that at the time, but when Mary Lynn returned home to Charleston and started to unpack her suitcase, that's when she saw it. Someone had gone through her suitcase and stolen her underwear and her makeup, and Mary Lynn knew immediately that it was Brown. So she called up her mother to tell her what had happened.
Wait, why is her mind jumping there? They're like 2 hours away. Wouldn't it be more likely that it could have been some random stranger, or even that maybe she just forgot them?
Sure, but I mean, we know that Brown had followed Mary Lynn to other locations before, like when she moved to Mount Pleasant.
Right, but what about the makeup though?
So from what I can tell, it seems like Brown was struggling with their gender identity and expression. They were assigned male at birth, but they had this interest in Mary Lynn's clothing and makeup going all the way back to childhood. And I have to warn you, if you decide to look into some of the sources for today's episode, this part of the story I don't think is handled really well by other outlets covering the case. It's treated as kind of this like dark and disturbing fact about Brown, when that's probably the least disturbing thing about any of this.
Yeah, the issue isn't that they were interested in women's underwear or makeup, or that they were exploring their gender identity. The issue is they were stalking Mary Lynn,
right,
and stealing from her and violating her privacy.
Exactly. So when Mary Lynn's mother learns this, she actually tries to get in touch with Brown over the phone and was basically like, look, I know it was you who broke into my house and who stole Mary Lynn's things. This is not cool, so you need to return those things to Mary Lynn. Brown didn't deny it, but they also didn't apologize or anything like that either. Apparently they just put all the items in a bag and left it in Mary Lynn's carport.
And did Mary Lynn report it at that point? Like this very clearly has escalated now, and it's clear a crime has been committed.
Yes, so you're right, but no, Mary Lynn decided not to get the police involved. Again, I don't think she saw this so much as an escalation of the stalking behavior necessarily, more like it's more of the same stuff Brown had been doing for years since they were a kid. And the other thing is that Mary Lynn had always been a very private person, and the items involved in the theft were personal to her, so that kind of factored into the decision too.
So did getting caught in this confrontation with Mary Lynn's mom scare Brown off at all?
I don't actually know. So the theft happened in 1989, and the period right after this isn't super well covered in my source material, because most of them just jump straight from there to 1991.
And what happened in 1991?
Well, that's when Brown just disappeared.
What?
Yeah, according to that NBC News report I mentioned, at some point in 1991, Mary Lynn just stopped seeing Brown around anywhere. First, it was a few days that went by where this person wasn't invading her life. But then those days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months to years. And at a certain point, Mary Lynn finally let herself feel at peace. She was no longer constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if Brown would be there. She wasn't worried that she'd come home to find her personal belongings missing. She was just enjoying her life, enjoying Charleston, a city that she loved so much, enjoying teaching French to her students, and at one point she even accompanied them on a trip to France.
So she's just like living her best life.
Totally. Mary Lynn lived a pretty normal life, the nightmare finally over for 10 years, until one day in 2001. Mary Lynn was at home when something caught her eye in her backyard. Not something, it was someone. And as soon as she realized who it was, she was pulled right back into that nightmare once again. There, in Mary Lynn's backyard, was Brown. It had been a decade since Mary Lynn had seen them, and now Brown wasn't a 10-year-old kid or even a confused 18-year-old anymore. They were a 30-year-old adult calmly standing on Mary Lynn's property, almost inviting her to catch them. And even though she was terrified, Mary Lynn somehow found the courage to walk outside, ready to talk to Brown and hopefully find a way to end things once and for all. But as soon as she stepped outside, Brown turned around and fled. That wasn't the end though, because soon they were back to their old ways, showing up on Mary Lynn's property. And they also would harass her with phone calls. They'd create all these different female personas that were obviously fake, and even though they weren't necessarily threatening Mary Lynn with these calls, she was still just feeling worn down from the whole experience.
I feel like at this point, it was probably getting more and more difficult for Mary Lynn to kind of excuse all of this behavior.
Yeah, and even Mary Lynn's friends were seeing the red flags, so actually they decided to contact Brown's father.
I mean, honestly, I was kind of wondering where he was in all of this too. Like, not only is this your child, but they're stalking a woman that you claim to love for years, who you proposed to multiple times.
Right? It stood out to me too. But actually, it seems like Edmonds kind of like washed his hands of Brown at some point during the last decade. Mary Lynn's sister Jackie told Keith Morrison of NBC News that Edmonds really didn't have much to do with Brown at that point, and when Mary Lynn's friends called him, he did nothing.
And did anyone contact the authorities then?
No. Mary Lynn still preferred to keep all of this private. She would tell her friends and family that there wasn't anything criminal about standing in front of her house. Like, Brown wasn't hurting anybody, really. But it's not Brown's individual actions or behaviors that makes this a crime. It is the pattern of behavior that makes it a crime.
Right, so, like, if this was happening today, and Brown was sending Mary Lynn, like, hundreds of text messages every day, there's nothing illegal about sending a text message, or even multiple, but the amount of text messages and the frequency is what would, elevate it or could elevate it to stalking.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And, I think Mary Lynn probably saw this behavior as disturbing, but ultimately harmless. But that doesn't mean it can't cross a line, which is what happened in April of 2003. Mary Lynn was doing her laundry when she noticed that something was missing. It was her underwear. And obviously, this wasn't the first or even the second time Mary Lynn had dealt with this. But back then, Brown had been younger. This time, it really seemed to get under Mary Lynn's skin. And so this is when she decided it was time to protect herself. She installed a new security system in her home then. She got mace and pepper spray, plus a panic button on her keychain. And she actually did get in touch with some police officers, but not like filing an official report. Mary Lynn was actually friends with some local officers, so she basically just asked them to keep an eye out for her. And she had a bunch of their phone numbers at the ready so she could call if anything with Brown escalated and she needed immediate help. And that day when she needed help actually came sooner than Mary Lynn expected. Just 3 months later, in July of 2003, Mary Lynn once again spotted Brown in her backyard. But something was different this time, because Brown wasn't just standing there and watching. They were holding something. It was a pillowcase filled with Mary Lynn's clothes. And this really terrified Mary Lynn, because this was the first time she had caught Brown in the act, and she wasn't really certain how they would react. And in the moment, it seemed like Brown was almost taunting Mary Lynn, just standing there, holding her things, looking her right in the eyes as if they were wanting to get caught, or maybe even wanting to frighten her, which definitely worked. I mean, Mary Lynn was too scared to even move, but thankfully, Brown eventually just walked away. Now, as soon as this incident happened, her whole family started saying, you need to report this, and you need to do it now. And it's not that Mary Lynn disagreed, but naturally she was scared. What would Brown do when they found out that Mary Lynn had called the police on them? But ultimately, she decided it was worth the risk to report the burglary. And after that, Brown was arrested and charged. And it turned out that in the years since all of this started happening with Mary Lynn, Brown had a number of run-ins with police.
For stalking other people?
No, not that I'm aware of. Keith Morrison reported that it was things like break-and-enters and car thefts. And when Brown was arrested for burglary because of the incident at Mary Lynn's house, they actually pled guilty and then just sat in jail awaiting sentencing. But Mary Lynn knew that Brown wasn't going to be in jail forever, and she didn't want to risk being caught off guard by their presence ever again. And so she registered for a victim notification system called VINE, which stands for Victim Information and Notification Every Day, which would automatically call her and send her a letter if Brown was released or transferred.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
So in the meantime, this let Mary Lynn stand down a little bit, at least until she got that call about Brown's release. Except that call never came. Instead, there was that other call, the one that Jane got on November 14, 2003, telling her that her mother hadn't shown up at work. And that brings us back to the investigation that's happening.
So, Brown was in jail when Mary Lynn was killed?
Well, when Jane and the rest of Mary Lynn's family find out about her murder, their minds automatically jump to Brown, like I said, because of course they would. But they're also conflicted like you. They're Mary Lynn would have known if Brown had been released because she would have gotten one of those calls or letters through VINE. And they feel if she would have gotten a notification, she would have at least mentioned it to someone.
Oh, for sure.
So police look into it, again, thinking Brown should be sitting in jail, but Brown wasn't in jail at all.
What?
And it's not so much where Brown wasn't that was concerning, it's where they were. Because when the investigators at the scene are given photos of Brown, they're stunned. Because the person they're looking at in these photos had been at the scene of the crime all day long, walking up and down the street, watching the investigation unfold.
You're kidding me.
No. Of course, Brown isn't there any longer. But at least now police know it's only a matter of time before they come back for another look. All investigators need to do is set a trap. Now, police know that their prime suspect has been making a habit of returning to the scene of the crime. So they decide to send home the investigative unit, basically to make it look like the work at Mary Lynn's house has been all wrapped up. And I think they did this because they're curious, what will Brown do if it looks like the house has just been totally abandoned? But of course, the truth is that authorities have a stakeout team monitoring the property. And I'm not exaggerating here. Within 20 minutes of this whole trap being set up, Brown comes walking down the street, walks right up to Mary Lynn's door, and pulls out a set of keys to unlock the front door.
What?
Which is all police need to see before they pop out and start asking questions. It's clear right away that Brown understands exactly what's going on and why investigators are at Marilyn's house, because they refuse to answer any questions and they request an attorney. But, Brown has the keys to both Marilyn's house and car, which is enough for an arrest.
Yeah, I agree, but I feel like we skipped over a pretty big chunk of the story here. Why wasn't Brown still in jail? And why did Marilyn not know about this?
Yeah, so remember how I said that Brown was awaiting sentencing?
Right.
Well, the courts ultimately decided that the best course of action for Brown was mental health treatment. A Wire report in the Times and Democrat noted that Brown took medication for bipolar disorder and also had Asperger's syndrome. So I suspect that those were some of the reasons that this option was even on the table. But all this means that on November 10th, 4 days before Marilyn's murder, Brown was released under the condition that they receive outpatient counseling, medication, and supervision, which is the moment Marilyn should have received a notification from Vine.
Hey.
According to Glenn Smith's reporting for the Post and Courier, Brown was taken to see a counselor at a mental health clinic who evaluated them, then told them that they were basically free to go. But they just had to return in 2 days for additional counseling. But the thing is, Brown never did come back to that clinic. And if nothing else, that should have been enough for this clinic to basically sound all of the alarm bells and have Brown picked up. But that also just didn't happen.
And during all of this, Marilyn just legit never got the notification that Brown was released?
Well, she actually did, but you are not going to believe this. Apparently, there was a backlog or some kind of administrative error. Basically, the notification from Vine arrived in her mailbox 1 day after she had been murdered.
Oh.
But here's the thing, even if it had arrived on time, the letter is factually incorrect anyway. It says that Brown was being transferred to another facility, not released into the community. Now, apparently, Vine also attempted to contact Marilyn on her home phone, like with a robocall kind of situation, but she was never home when the calls came in, and they just ended up on her answering machine, and so she never, got them. Though, again, even the automated message was also incorrect, so it's not even clear how helpful that would have been anyway.
So basically, this is just a failure, on every single level.
Absolutely.
Which left Marilyn completely vulnerable and not even knowing it.
Yeah, and on top of that, the more police dig into Brown as a suspect, the more they discover evidence that this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment escalation. It was something that Brown had been planning. They find a handwritten manifesto that Brown had put together in prison, in which they explicitly write out their plans to, quote, take care of MLW, and, quote, ice MLW. So, nothing ambiguous about that.
Right.
Police also find pages among Brown's things where they seem to be practicing how to forge Marilyn's signature.
So Brown's not obsessed with Marilyn in I'm in love with her kind of way. It's more like trying to assume her identity.
That's kind of the theory that police land on. And some of the other evidence police discovered during the investigation actually supports that theory. For one, it turns out that when Brown was arrested, they were wearing some of Marilyn's clothing. Police also discovered that after Marilyn's murder, Brown had gone and had their driver's license updated to Marilyn's address. And what's more, as investigators were continuing to process the scene, a package arrived containing wigs in Marilyn's hair color and other items that to them could be used to help Brown impersonate Marilyn. All of this is a really solid circumstantial case, but police find even more than just circumstantial evidence. They find DNA at the crime scene that is a match for Brown.
So, do they know anything about what happened the day of the murder? I know there was no sign of forced entry. How did Brown get into the house?
So they have at least an idea of how they think things played out that day. Basically, they think that Brown likely surprised Marilyn at her front door, either by knocking or just being there when she opened it to leave. And from there, Brown forced their way inside the house and attacked Marilyn. There was definitely a struggle. That's why her things were scattered around on the floor. But Brown eventually got her up to the second floor, where they sexually assaulted her, strangled her, and placed her in the bathtub. Now, luckily, Mary Lynn's loved ones were spared the additional trauma of going through a trial because on July 12, 2004, Brown pleads guilty to Mary Lynn's murder and is sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. But Mary Lynn's family knows that this should have never happened in the first place, and they are determined to make sure that it never happens again. Mary Lynn's sister Jackie and her daughter Jane work with state legislators to create Mary Lynn's Law, which is designed to close all of those gaps in the system that had left Mary Lynn vulnerable. For one, Mary Lynn's Law would require authorities to notify a victim in person if an offender is released from prison and the automated system hasn't been able to make contact within 3 attempts. Mary Lynn's Law also proposed changes to South Carolina's mental health court system. For example, according to a letter written by Mary Lynn's sister Jackie and published in the item, if anyone who is arrested for stalking needs to undergo mental health treatment, they would need to complete that treatment while still incarcerated. And on May 26, 2005, less than 2 years after Mary Lynn's murder, South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford signed the bill into law.
That's so amazing, and it must be such a relief for Mary Lynn's family to know that her legacy can protect other people in similar situations.
Absolutely, and as tragic and senseless as Mary Lynn's murder was, I think it is super important that we not treat this case as only a murder, because Mary Lynn was also stalked, again, for over 20 years. And that in and of itself is a horrific and traumatizing crime. A crime that is happening all the time to people all around us. In fact, according to Spark, over the course of a year, there are up to 7.5 million people in the United States alone who experience stalking. And nearly 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men will experience some form of stalking in their lifetime.
Oh, wow. I mean, I kind of guessed that stalking would disproportionately affect women, but that's actually a lot of men as well.
Totally. And what I really want crime junkies to know and to get out of this episode is how to identify stalking in the first place. Because it can start out seeming kind of, annoying or weird maybe, but not outright dangerous. Like when a person is just walking by too often or showing up once or twice unannounced or just calling a little more than normal, you might be inclined to brush it off. Like, oh, I've known this person forever, they're harmless.
Right. Like, I immediately would be freaked out by, some stranger in a trench coat walking by or showing up on my doorstep. But
right, yeah.
I think human nature would make it pretty easy to brush off that kind of thing or convince yourself you're overreacting if it's someone that you know or like a friend of a friend kind of person.
Totally. And no one wants to be weird or rude, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I couldn't stop thinking about as I was researching this story is, you know that thing that they say about boiled frogs?
You mean that thing where, like, if you put a frog into a pot of boiling water, it'll die, but if you put it into just, like, a pot of regular water and slowly bring it to a boil, it won't?
Yeah, that. So not true, by the way. But the concept is so spot on, I think, because, think about if a person out of nowhere broke into your house and stole your underwear. You would be immediately like, okay, red flags. This is a crime. This is wrong. But what if they were someone you knew and at first they started calling too often and you're like, well, at least they aren't showing up in person. But then they start showing up in person and you're like, well, they're not trying to get in my house, whatever. And then they start getting in your house and you're like, well, at least they're not being violent and so on. So my worry is if we don't spot this stuff early and trust our guts and call it for what it is, stalking, then how can we really protect ourselves or each other? Britt, I sent you some stuff that we got from Spark, and I'm hoping that you can give us a little bit of a rundown on what people should be looking for and what they should do if they see it. Like, yes, be weird, be rude, but, like, what kind of weird and what kind of rude?
So this story happened in the 90s and early 2000s, and obviously a ton has changed in technology since then. But the core behavior of stalking is really still the same. It's someone making themselves an unwanted presence in their victim's life. And that can still mean showing up at your house or at work or whatever. But it can also mean, like you said, unwanted phone calls, the text messages we referenced earlier, or social media interaction. And another big component of stalking is monitoring. So these days, that could include things like GPS monitoring or cameras or listening devices, like all sorts of things.
Right. So if me or like someone listening is experiencing that or even seeing that happen to someone else, like what's the next step? What do you do?
Well, you already said it. The most important thing you can do is trust your gut. According to Spark, stalking victims will often downplay the seriousness of what they're experiencing. I mean, we saw that all over in this case. And I think that this is one of the clearest instances where people should be weird and rude. If you think you're experiencing stalking, contact the authorities, especially if you think you're in immediate danger. But the other thing Spark recommends is that victims log behavior. And it feels a little bit like asking the victims to do the heavy lifting by themselves, but it serves multiple purposes because not only are you keeping a record of whenever a potential stalker contacts you, you'll also be better able to convince yourself that you aren't just overreacting. Like, there will be a written log.
Yeah.
You can see it with your own eyes.
I would say there's something about seeing it in black and white. Like, okay, it's not just a feeling. Like, this is a lot. And if I compare this to, like, any other interaction I have in my life, like, this isn't normal or okay.
Exactly. And you can hold on to every piece of evidence you can, like text messages or voicemails, and log those too. You can reach out to domestic violence or victim services programs in your community, and they can help you build a safety plan, which might include things like varying your daily routine or seeking a protective order, or even providing a photo or description of your stalker to your neighbors, your colleagues, security guards at your office, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, listen, you guys, Spark, which again is the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, has so many incredible resources and a lot of great information on their website, which is stalkingawareness.org. We're going to link to that in our show notes on the blog post like we always do. We've also chosen to sponsor the organization to help them continue their amazing work. So please take some time to get familiar with this and use them as a resource. Again, even if you don't feel like you've ever been stalked, or, this is so far away from you, it'll never be in your realm, it might not be you. It might be someone you know who needs help. Mary Lynn Witherspoon lost her life on November 14, 2003. But for more than 20 years before that, she also lost her right to live a happy and peaceful life without the constant fear that she was being watched or followed or violated. So if there's one thing I want our listeners to take away from this case, it's that stalking is a truly serious crime, and one that can destroy lives in so many different ways. But there are ways to protect yourself. There are resources out there. You just need to take the time to educate yourself. Again, you guys, you can find all of the links to the resources we mentioned for this episode in the show notes and on our blog post. All of our source material will also be on our blog post. You can find that at crimejunkiepodcast.com.
And be sure to follow us on Instagram at crimejunkiepodcast.
And we'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Crime Junkie is an Audio Chuck production. So, what do you think, Chuck? Do you approve? Hi, Crime Junkies. I'm your host, Ashley Flowers.
And I'm Britt.
And the story I have for you today takes place in a quiet town outside of New York City, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. A beloved wife and mother vanishes, seemingly into thin air, leaving her friends and family wondering where she could have gone and why she left in the first place. Her disappearance sends shockwaves through the community, and over a decade passes before a tragic discovery leaves everyone with more questions than answers. This is the story of Patricia Viola. It's 4:30 p.m. on February 13, 2001, and 40-year-old Jim Viola is arriving home from work. He and his family live on a quiet street in Bogota, New Jersey, and as Jim walks up to the door, he's expecting another normal night with his family. Since it's the day before Valentine's Day, Jim had actually left work early to pick up some gifts for Pat before he headed home. And so he walks up to the house. He's like trying to balance his briefcase, those wrapped presents in one hand while opening the door with the other. Once he gets inside, he's expecting to see Pat to be there like always during this time of day. But instead, he's struck by something odd. The house alarm is beeping, signaling that it had been activated. You know, it's one of those alarms that gives you around like 20 or 30 seconds to like punch in the code before it notifies the security company. Yeah, so Jim immediately puts everything down, rushes to the keypad to enter the code, all while thinking like, where is Pat? Because the Violas don't usually keep the alarm set while they're in the house. They only set it either when they leave or when they go to sleep. And again, Pat is almost always there when Jim gets home.
So the alarm being set in general already indicates that Pat isn't home, which is out of the ordinary.
Exactly. According to a disappeared episode that aired back in 2011 titled Missing Valentine, Pat and her family all have very consistent schedules. And Pat's routine for the entirety of their marriage always included her being home when Jim got off work. So this is super strange in his mind, but he doesn't jump to the worst. Once Jim enters the code and disarms the security system, he turns and notices something else kind of out of place. The key that they usually keep left in the deadbolt of their back door is laying on the kitchen table. Once again, this is weird. So out of curiosity, he goes to check if Pat's coat and purse are where she usually leaves them. Now, her coat is gone, but her purse is still there with her ID, her cell phone keys, and concerningly, her epilepsy medication.
And is her epilepsy pretty severe?
Yes, actually. Pat had been diagnosed with epilepsy at 12 years old, and she takes 2 medications throughout the course of the day in order to prevent seizures. And really, it was so bad that according to that disappeared episode, Pat had her driver's license suspended a few months prior as a result of a really bad grand mal seizure that landed her in the hospital.
Oh, yeah, that sounds really serious.
Yeah. I mean, obviously she ended up recovering, but the doctor told her not to drive for several months afterwards. So now finding this medication is extra important because when Jim finds it, it's almost 5 o'clock and Pat is due to take her evening meds really soon. So the fact that she left without them is enough to make Jim start to feel uneasy.
I mean, is it possible that she just stepped out to run to the store real quick and would be back soon? I mean, you said she left most of her personal belongings in the house. I mean, she could have just taken some cash and walked to a convenience store nearby, right?
Well, that's what Jim's hoping for right now. I mean, you know, she's a 42-year-old woman. She can handle herself. But as the minutes and hours come and go, that uneasy feeling that he has starts to just build. So just to be safe and put his mind to ease, he starts to call around to family and friends. But phone call after phone call turns up no clues as to where she might be. Fox 5 reported that Jim even goes out and drives the routes where she might have gone with his high beams on, searching for any sign of her, but he comes back with nothing. Now, he can sense in his gut that something is really wrong with this. She wouldn't just leave without telling anyone. So with no other lead for him to track down, and now in full-blown panic mode, Jim calls the Bogota police at 11:58 p.m. to report his wife missing. 2 officers are dispatched immediately to the house, and they file an official report that evening.
Wow, I'm honestly kind of surprised they didn't make him wait 24 or 48 hours before filing anything.
Yeah, this is different than what we normally see, but I think that they're taking this so seriously because she's at high risk without her medication. Now, unfortunately, there's not much they can do that night since by the time they take the statements after midnight, but the police start working the case first thing the next morning. As they start the investigation, the very first thing police try to do is nail down a timeline of events for the morning and afternoon of the 13th. Jim tells them that the family had an entirely normal morning. Everyone had been up on time. Jim got ready for work like he always did. He was out the door by 6:30. And when speaking to police, he said he remembers Pat seeming a little down or maybe sad, but it wasn't enough to make him even worry that something was wrong. She just seemed a little melancholy that morning. Now, they learned that the Violas had 2 kids, Christine, who's 13, and Michael, who just turned 10. And they left next to go to school, and then Pat left shortly after them at 8:30. And they're able to verify this because she set the alarm around 8:30 that morning, like she was leaving. And from there, they're able to confirm that she did make it to her son's school, where she worked as a volunteer librarian during the day.
And did anyone at the school notice anything off? while she's there?
No, not at all. According to information Jim Viola would later post on patriciaviolamissing.homestead.com, when law enforcement talks to other volunteers and staff at the school, a few of them say that she may have been a little quieter than usual, but there were like zero red flags for them. Police confirm with the school that Pat left at 11:30, and they even tracked down a mailman who said that he waved to Pat on her way home at about 11:40. Once they begin searching Pat's home, police discover a message on the Viola's answering machine from earlier that morning, and it's from Pat's mom. In this voicemail, her mom says that the Viola's security company had called her asking if everything was okay at Jim and Pat's house because apparently the alarm had been tripped.
Wait, why did they call Pat's mom? Did they try to contact Jim and Pat first?
So they did. It's protocol for them to call the homeowners first to check if everything was okay. But Jim was at work, I guess couldn't take the call. Pat was at school. She had a cell phone but didn't really keep it on or check it. So they weren't able to reach either of them. So they actually got in touch with their emergency contact, which in this case was Pat's mom.
And then Pat's mom contacted them. Got it.
Right,
that makes sense.
Right. Now, the security company also contacted the police, who did send an officer to the home to check for signs of a break-in. But upon not seeing anything that would indicate that something bad had happened, there were no broken windows, no open doors, nothing, they just left.
Okay, is it possible that someone was in the house and they just didn't see? Maybe someone had picked a lock on their door or something?
So, I don't know. This is honestly my biggest problem with how people respond to security system alarms going off, because I've had that happen here before where I would set it off and the police come by and just kind of peek around and I'm oh my god, if someone was holding me hostage in here, you're just gonna leave?
Right.
I don't know. So they literally just walked the perimeter. They didn't go inside. So it is totally possible that you're right. Someone picked the lock. Someone's waiting inside. But they say that everything looked calm and they basically tell the security company, check it out, nothing's wrong. And from what I gather, the ultimate theory that they think happened is that maybe Pat didn't fully close the door on her way out that morning, which made the alarm go off.
Okay, but then the door would be open, right?
It might have been open. The next person that comes home is actually Pat herself, before Jim, before anything. So if the door had been left open a little bit or wasn't locked or something, we don't know because Patricia's not here to tell us. When police get a hold of Pat's mom to see if she ever connected with Pat after she left the voicemail, she tells them, yes, this is what I mean. Pat had actually come home. She called her back at 12:30, reassured her that everything was okay, and she said that during that call, her daughter was totally normal. While it's unclear what Pat did after that call to her mom, the last thing police are able to confirm is that she actually did reset the alarm at 1:11 p.m. And this to them indicates that she is leaving the house around that time. So this is when she would have closed the door, locked the door, and that's how Jim would have found the house. So police then go speak to neighbors, but no one reports seeing or even hearing anything suspicious at all that day. Denise Superville and Scott Fallon reported for the Herald News that police begin stopping buses and contacting taxi companies to see if anyone had picked her up, thinking that, she likely had left willingly since they found no sign otherwise so far. They also even contacted nearby airports to see if she had flown that day. But phone call after phone call, stop after stop gives them no leads. As the hours tick by, the pressure to find Pat is building. She has now missed several doses of her epilepsy medication, so the risk of her having a seizure is increasing by the second. And since Pat is at a severe risk, police ramp up the search efforts and bring in a police dog to try and track her scent, thinking that they could at least get an idea of where she went by picking up her trail if she left the house. But the dogs aren't able to pick up anything. They even go so far as to do an aerial search over local rivers and marshes, but after a few days with nothing to go on, it almost seems like she disappeared into thin air.
So, I know police haven't suspected foul play at this point, but after a few days with no answers, they've got to be wondering if someone else was involved in the disappearance, right?
Well, as a matter of fact, they are. Police have two primary theories at this point. So one is that she left on her own, and two is that she met with foul play. And since they aren't getting anywhere with the first option, they begin considering the second, that someone made Pat disappear. And they think that person responsible might be closer to home than they realize. So, remember when I said that Jim had left work early that day Pat went missing to go get some Valentine's Day gifts?
Yeah, I don't know about anybody else, but that little detail definitely stuck out to me.
Yeah, well, when police start investigating for possible criminal activity, that detail sticks out to them, too. Now, Jim has been cooperating fully with the police the entire time, but as part of their investigation, they have to take a look at those closest to Pat and consider all the options. So, several days into the investigation, police decide to bring Jim in for questioning. According to the disappeared episode, police questioned Jim for several hours. They asked him about every part of his day. Why did he leave early from work? Can anyone verify where he was? Did he go anywhere other than the store to buy those gifts? And they also questioned him about his relationship with Pat and if they were having any marital issues. But after a grueling few hours and a polygraph, police are confident that he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance. But just because Jim isn't a suspect doesn't mean police don't learn anything important from his interview. In fact, they get a ton of information about Pat that tells them a lot about the days leading up to her going missing. Importantly, Jim tells them Pat had been experiencing quite a few stressors in her life before she went missing.
What kind of stressors?
Well, for one, Jim's mom had been really sick recently, and since Jim worked full-time, Pat was kind of the one who had to take care of her. And while this wasn't the biggest burden in the world, it was kind of just one more person that she had to take care of, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So while caring for Jim's mom was manageable for Pat, Jim tells police that a much more crushing blow came just a few weeks before her disappearance. Remember how I said that Pat's license had been suspended a few months prior to her going missing?
Yeah.
Well, according to reporting by Karen Mahabir for NorthJersey.com, her seizures had been becoming more frequent before that one that caused her license to be taken away. And that suspension was supposed to last until January, as long as she didn't have any more seizures. But in that disappeared episode, Jim said that the doctor had just extended that license suspension by another 3 months right before Patricia had gone missing. And this really bothered Pat because it meant that she couldn't do the things she loved, like driving her kids to and from school or the activities, or, she couldn't go to the mall by herself for, at this point, we're talking it could be 6 months.
I actually completely kind of get this. My dad had a health issue, and when I was 16, he had his license suspended for about a year because of his health, and it really took a lot of his independence away. He couldn't.
Yeah.
He had to depend on us, on me, a 16-year-old, to drive him to work every day.
So hard. Yeah. Now, in addition to all of this, that's not enough. Jim also says that his sister Donna had recently moved in with the family after a nasty breakup with a boyfriend. And even though it was only supposed to be temporary, some of Donna's habits were really grinding Pat, getting under her skin.
Well, and also just a house guest staying that long. Ugh. But what kind of habits?
Well, what bothered Pat the most was Donna's smoking. Police learned from Jim that Donna would smoke in the house. And so basically, after Donna left every day, Pat would go in and do her best to make the cigarette smell go away. She would try vacuuming, she would use air fresheners, that kind of thing. And I can imagine that Pat saw Donna as sort of just, again, another person she's having to look after and clean up after and worry about in her home on top of every other member of her family. But the thing is, while the smoking was definitely annoying, again, definitely getting under her skin, Pat hadn't said anything to Donna about it. Again, I think in her mind, she's thinking, okay, this is just temporary. I just have to get over this, hump, however long this is going to be. So she was basically just putting up with it for the time being. That is until February 12th, which is the day before she went missing. That's when she found cigarette burns on the guest bedspread. And this, set her off because now, not only is the bedspread ruined, this is a major fire hazard.
Yeah, and her 2 kids are in this house. I can totally see how this would kind of up the ante, and she'd be incredibly bothered by this.
I would be furious. So she obviously talks to Jim about it, and Pat had planned to confront Donna. Because to your point, you're putting my kids at risk now. This isn't just a nuisance. But they decided, okay, we're going to talk to her the next day. We're going to fix all of this.
Okay, why not confront her right then?
Well, the two are actually supposed to go to a party that evening hosted by Pat's best friend, Juanette. So I think they decided to just let it rest and come back to it the next morning. Just to again, let's have a nice night. Let's not have this family fight right now, and then we'll address it when we wake up.
Which makes sense, but how was she at the party? I know if it were me, you would be able to tell something was stewing.
Stewing, immediately.
Did any of her friends notice her acting strange or anything?
They actually did. And it's more than just her acting strange. There was a huge red flag at the party, but Jim didn't even know about it. Police only learned about it when they talked to Toinette. She tells police that she had a conversation with Pat when she came over for the party that just left her feeling totally shaken. Toinette says in an interview for Disappeared that when Jim and Pat first arrived, everything seemed normal. So she didn't get that red flag that she's pissed about something. Pat looked put together. She looked cheery. But once they made their way inside, Pat pulled her aside and was like, we need to talk right now. So Toinette, being a good friend, immediately took her into another room away from the other party guests and was shocked when Pat immediately just fell apart. Toinette tells police that between her tears, Pat told her something was very, very wrong.
Okay, did she say what that something was?
That's the thing, she didn't. Toinette says that Pat wouldn't give her any details as to what was going on, despite her asking repeatedly what it was. Pat only said that it was too complicated to go into at the party, but promised her that she would tell her everything if they could go away somewhere together for a few days. I mean, she went so far as to ask Toinette to cancel her vacation that she had coming up. That is how badly she needed her friend to help her get through whatever was happening. And to Toinette's credit, girl immediately agreed. She's like, I'm going to cancel everything. I'm going to drop everything. And she promised Pat that they could go anywhere she wanted to together. Which to me kind of makes me feel like this isn't just about Donna or her mother-in-law.
This feels so much bigger and almost scarier.
Yeah, I mean, don't you feel like if we were at a party, I'd just be like, I just feel so overwhelmed. Eric's mother's doing this and his sister's doing this. And I don't know, that feels like something you can unload. But to be like, I can't even tell you, it's too complicated. I mean, unless she was having bigger feelings about her life and marriage, I don't know.
I guess I'm making some assumptions about her relationship with Toinette, but I would assume that she already knows that Donna is living with Pat and Jim. And
good point.
That Jim's mom is already ailing and Pat has to take care of her. Those are things that, interfere with your daily life, kind of change up the schedule, and your really good friends would already know this. So this has to be something so much bigger, so much scarier. I mean, God, what could it be?
Well, what Pat says next is even more concerning. She says that she wanted Toinette to look after her kids no matter what happened to her.
What?
Yeah, and at this point, Toinette says she began crying. And again, she asked Pat, what is going on? But Pat only reinforced that she couldn't say anything, which these are the conversations. I think this is the crime junkie life rule, right? If you have something, you have to say it immediately or something is going to happen to you.
Right.
I mean, I think we talked about this in a past episode. If this were you have to swear to me. If something's happening, there can be no, we'll talk about this later. You have to unload immediately.
I promise if you promise.
Promise. And listen, again, Toinette was pressing hard, trying to get Pat to give her more information, but it became clear to her that she wasn't going to get any answers out of her friend. But she knew that they were going to talk later. So literally, that night after the party ended, she canceled her vacation.
And did they reconnect the next day?
Well, here's where things get so weird. Toinette called Pat the next morning, and according to Leslie Corrin's reporting for The Record, she definitely did seem a little off or upset. Again, this is the 13th, the day she ends up going missing. But just like the night before, Pat said that she didn't want to talk about it. And she actually ended up kind of totally brushing it off.
Wait, so her friend just canceled her vacation and Pat's like, oh, thanks, but never mind, forget about it.
Yes! I wouldn't let you off the hook. I'd be like, no, girl, I just canceled my vacation. You were crying at my house.
You asked me to take care of your kids no matter what.
Yeah, even if it seems okay today, there's something we should probably talk about.
Right.
But here's where things get even more bizarre. Once Pat got off the phone with Toinette, that's when Pat apparently stormed down the stairs and started screaming at Donna about the burnt bedspread. And both Donna and even Jim, when he later found out about this, were completely taken aback by this reaction because Jim says he doesn't even remember a time in their entire marriage when Pat ever raised her voice ever, much less berated someone the way she did Donna.
So I guess to me, this kind of sounds like one of those straw that broke the camel's back situations. She had all these things going on in her life, the driver's license, the family drama, and I mean, she was clearly struggling with something. All this has to have police going back to the theory that maybe Pat just walked away and there isn't any foul play involved.
Yeah, I mean, they look into her walking away or even into the possibility of suicide. But since there isn't any physical evidence to support it, there's no note, there's nothing to indicate what happened. Police don't actually jump to that conclusion and just close the case cold. And listen, Pat's family definitely doesn't believe that she died by suicide or took her own life in any kind of way. Jim says in that same article, for the record, quote, "I don't think she would do anything to herself, not with her mother and children in her life," end quote. Jim also tells police that despite the hardship she was facing, Pat actually had a lot of good things to look forward to. For example, the couple had just purchased a timeshare up in Pennsylvania that they had yet to visit, and they were looking forward to spending time up there as a family. At this point, it's been 2 weeks since Pat vanished. And even with police still searching, the likelihood that they'll find Pat alive and unharmed is getting slimmer and slimmer by the day. And that's when investigators are approached by Jim with a theory, one that he believes could be the key to bringing Pat home. Jim suggests that Pat could have run out to the store for something and maybe had a seizure while she was out. Pat had been interested in getting Jim this singing monkey in a cage for Valentine's Day, just as a cute little gag gift. But since it wasn't found at the house, he thinks that maybe she could have gone out to get it that afternoon that she went missing. Paul Johnson reported for the record that if Pat had experienced a seizure while going to or from the store, Jim thinks that she may have been seriously injured or maybe even gotten amnesia because of it. And maybe, just maybe, she's in a hospital somewhere and doesn't know who she is. And listen, I didn't know if amnesia was actually a common symptom of seizures, so Britt, I actually asked you to look this up for me while I continued to research this case. Do you want to tell everyone what you found?
Sure, and the basic answer is it can be. According to the Epilepsy Foundation, memory loss is actually a common side effect of epilepsy, but most people only experience small gaps in their memory or have difficulty recalling specific details like names or dates. And severe amnesia resulting in losing years of memory is usually only seen in severe epilepsy cases.
Okay, so from what we know, the only severe seizure that she had recently was the one that she had 3 months ago that resulted in her license being taken away. So while the likelihood of her suddenly losing all memory of who she wasn't entirely impossible, based on what you said, it seems kind of unlikely.
Yeah.
Ultimately, police tell Jim that they disagree with this theory, but they say for a different reason. You see, when a patient shows up to the hospital and they don't have any idea who they are, law enforcement is actually notified so they can assist in finding who this mystery person is.
Right, they become a living go.
Right, so if Pat really did lose her memory and was taken to a hospital, the police are listen, we would have been informed already. But still, Jim takes Pat's photo to every surrounding hospital just to be sure she's not there. But none of the hospitals have a Jane Doe that matches Pat's description. As February turns into March, the police are no closer to finding Pat. Jim sends her story to every local newspaper and gives interview after interview, hoping that someone will come forward with anything that will help them find his wife. And while the tips that come in are few and far between, all police need is just that one that could lead them down the right path. And in March, about a month after Pat disappeared, one of those tips does come that offers a glimmer of hope that they've been waiting for. In another piece written by Leslie Corrin for the record, a man calls police saying that he thinks he saw Pat up in Pennsylvania.
Which is where the family has their timeshare, right?
It is. Now, the family hadn't actually been up there to visit it yet, so it wasn't included in the initial search when they went out looking for her. But after that tip comes in, law enforcement jump on it. The tip had come from East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, which is about a 10-minute drive from where their timeshare is, which is located in Shawnee, Pennsylvania. So even though they're different towns, they're close enough that police are making the connection.
Right.
They contact the local police up there, and Jim himself actually drives up there to check the timeshare, thinking that, maybe the argument with Donna was enough to set her off, make her want to get away for a couple of days. Maybe something happened to her that's preventing her from coming home. But when he gets there, there's no sign of Pat, and it doesn't even look like she's been at the timeshare at all. While local police keep searching, Jim gets coverage of Pat's case on the local news and stops everyone who can to ask about Pat. But unfortunately, this ends up being yet another dead end. Over a year passes before the next tip comes in. And this time, it's unlike any other call they've ever gotten. On the other end is a man who claims to have killed Pat Viola. His exact words are actually, quote, "I killed the old girl," end quote. Police do their best to keep this man on the other end of the line talking as long as possible, trying to get his location and any other information out of him that they can before he hangs up. But as they're talking, he starts saying things that start making them think that maybe he had nothing to do with Pat's disappearance.
What makes them think that? Like, what did he say?
Well, the main thing is that he claims to have Pat's driver's license. And remember, they know that Pat didn't actually have a physical license at the time. Like, hers was suspended. So there doesn't seem any way that he could have it unless she had like an old copy, or it's just not adding up. Still, it's been like a year since they've had anything solid to go on, so they keep talking to this guy. They don't just write him off yet. And the man seems happy to keep talking. He conveniently offers up that he is headed up the East Coast on his way to Massachusetts, and that there's a woman traveling with him. And he even offers a description of the woman.
Okay, does this dude want to get caught?
Yeah, I mean, something's feeling off about this. Like, police are pretty convinced that this man probably has nothing to do with Pat's disappearance, but still, they want to be sure, so they mobilize a unit in North Carolina to intercept this bus that the man claims to be on. When they do, they don't find him, but they do find the woman he claimed to be traveling with. And it turns out that the caller is this woman's ex who's just upset that she left him for another man.
So he basically just wanted to make her life a little bit more difficult.
Exactly. After this tip, the case more or less officially goes cold. Police still work every tip they get, even though they are few and far between. Paul Johnson's piece for the Record says that people called in from all over New Jersey, Pennsylvania, even Montana with sightings of Pat, but time after time, these sightings lead nowhere. And while police are busy still working the case, again, they're not just letting it lie, Jim does everything he can to keep Pat in the public's eye. He even works with a private investigator, this guy named Gary Miko, who volunteers his services after seeing the website that Jim put together to help provide information on Pat's case. And when Gary begins his search, he hears of an interesting theory, a theory that some locals believe is the key to finding Pat. Even though the Violas live in a pretty safe neighborhood, just a few years before Pat went missing, there was actually another tragedy that struck their quiet suburban street. And the way the PI found out about this, blows my mind. And this is, proof for every crime junkie out there that you can actually be useful. And, if you know something, don't assume everyone else does too. Because I think this guy was, walking up the street and happened to run into the mailman. And the mailman's like, "It's really hard for me to believe that her disappearance didn't have something to do with the crime that happened across the street." And the guy's like,
What crime that happened across the street?
Exactly. No one else had pieces together. Crime junkies out there, you can be useful. But anyways, according to a New York Times article by Robert Hanley, the safe, family-friendly town of Bogota was shaken when 3 men were found murdered in a home just down the street from the Violas on October 23rd, 1997. The homeowner, 36-year-old Rajesh, had been at home with 2 men, Ajit and Bhushan, when 2 men forced their way in and shot them all execution style.
Oh my God. I mean, was this a robbery gone wrong?
So Rajesh was a successful diamond wholesaler, which at first made police think that the murders were part of a robbery. But Paulo Lima would later report for the Record that the robbery was actually secondary to the murder. Ajit and Bhushan were definitely not intended to be victims of the crime. They were really just at the wrong place at the wrong time. But Rajesh had been a target of a man named Dimpy for months. Dimpy had hired 2 men, Miguel and Richard, to kill Rajesh, saying he, quote, swindled some friends of his, end quote. In addition to a fee for the murder, Dimpy promised that they could keep any of the cash or gems they found in the home. And the 2 did end up taking a large sum of money in jewels after the murders that had been carried out. Ultimately, 4 men were arrested for the triple homicide of Rajesh, Ajit, and Bhushan. The 3 I just mentioned, Miguel, Richard, and Dimpy, as well as a man named Darwin, who actually introduced Miguel to Dimpy and acted as the driver.
Okay, so what does this triple homicide from 97 have to do with Pat going missing in 2001?
Well, it's all about timing, because Miguel, Richard, and Darwin were all going to trial around that time. And according to court documents, Miguel even tried to hire someone to kill 2 of the witnesses.
So, what? People think that Pat could have been on that list of witnesses?
So again, this is like rumored at the time. Maybe she was, or another theory that a lot of people have is maybe there was some kind of mix-up. Like they were looking for someone that they thought was a witness and got Pat instead. Now, Gary is skeptical when he first hears about this, but he looks into it anyway. I mean, after all, the police have no leads at this point, so he's going to look into any possible lead that comes his way. But in the end, he thinks the likelihood of Pat's case being related to this specific crime is highly unlikely, because Pat was not a witness. She was not involved in the triple homicide case in any way. She wasn't on the list. She never gave any statements to police or to media. So she likely wasn't targeted as part of the scheme to get rid of a witness. Again, maybe there's still this out there theory that she was mistaken for someone else, but like she had zero ties to the case officially. After this last lead, the case kind of stalls again. As the years pass, police continue to work the case, but without any viable leads, it just remains cold. Jim and the Viola family never give up hope of finding Pat, and Jim actually becomes an influential figure in legislation regarding missing people. In 2008, he works alongside government officials and other loved ones of missing people in the state of New Jersey to pass Patricia's Law, which is a law that requires police to take every missing persons report regardless of the circumstance and inform the family of available support services. Additionally, if the missing person has not been found within 30 days, police have to take DNA samples of the missing person and enter them into a national database.
Hi. I feel like every state should have this law.
I know, again, this is one of those things where you're just like, I just assumed they were doing these things, but like apparently you have to put it down in like black and white for people to do this, but agreed. As time continues to pass with no movement in the case, everyone involved is haunted by questions that they still have about that cold day in February. But in 2012, they found that an answer to at least one of their questions was closer than they realized. According to the Herald News article I mentioned toward the top of this episode, police get a call from the University of North Texas's Center for Human Identification. This call comes in on September 11th, 2012. And in this call, they say that human remains that were found washed ashore in 2002 have been identified as Pat Viola's through DNA.
Wait, 2002.
2002.
They had her remains a year after she went missing?
Well, they only had partial remains. You see, on July 27th, 2002, again, 10 years before they're getting this call, a bone fragment from a left foot was found washed ashore by a man walking on Rockaway Beach in Queens. It was found along with a sock and a white sneaker that matched the ones Pat had been wearing the day that she disappeared. Get this, even though the remains were found in 2002, DNA wasn't extracted until 2005.
Okay, why did it take them 3 years to get a DNA sample?
So immediately my head exploded when I heard that until I read this article in the Herald News that says the medical examiner's office was still overwhelmed by the aftermath of 9/11 at the time of the discovery. I forgot how close it was to New York City.
Yeah.
They still had over 21,000 unidentified remains and over 1,000 people had not been positively identified yet. So, again, I can kind of appreciate why it would take a little bit longer for them to analyze the remains, but I don't think it can explain the fact that it took another 4 years for that DNA, once it was extracted, to be sent to the University of North Texas for analysis.
They held on to the DNA until 2009?
Sure did.
Why?
Well, the medical examiner's office doesn't give any answer as to why. But even after that, the remains aren't confirmed to be Pat's until 2012.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm struggling to process the entire thing as to why it took a decade. How did it take this long for remains to be identified? Did they just not have anything to compare it to, or what?
So that's part of the problem. Again, I have no explanation for why it took years after extraction to just be sent off. But Pat's kids didn't submit an updated DNA sample to CODIS until 2011. And that is actually what the remains are matched to. And look, these things take time. It's not like what we see on TV where everything happens instantly.
Right.
But the fact that these remains literally sat in storage for over a decade is, again, frustrating for me, but it's frustrating to police and the Viola family, who spent how much time and resources over the last decade looking for a missing person who has likely been deceased this whole time.
Right. So even though it's only a bone fragment, a sock, and a shoe, are investigators able to come up with a more concrete theory as to what happened to Pat, or even how she ended up in the water in the first place?
No, unfortunately, they can't come to any conclusions based on the small amount of bone fragment that they have. Rockaway Beach is about 5.5 miles long and leads into the Atlantic Ocean, so there's really no telling where or how her body could have gone into the water. And I mean, at the time of the discovery, police had actually searched the beach on foot with helicopters, trying to find like any additional remains, but they never ended up finding anything else.
So what could have happened to her? I mean, is there even like a short list?
No, I mean, I think you go back to the theories they had from the day she walked away, right? Like, did she go away on her own? There is still the possibility that maybe she took her own life, that she jumped into a body of water somewhere. But then you have to ask, how on earth did she get there, right? Like, she couldn't drive. She didn't take a bus. We know that she didn't take a plane or a taxi or whatever.
Well, and on top of that, like, I personally can't shake the whole house alarm going off. Like,
I don't love that.
What?
Yeah, I can't get over. Everyone seems so willing to just be like, oh, she must have left the door open and it like tripped on its own. I don't know why that just does not sit right with me. And I mean, again, was someone waiting in the house when she made that call to her mom? Was she alone? I have so many questions about this case. And, you know, there was even one, I didn't add it in the story because, like, I couldn't verify it in multiple places. But in the disappeared episode, her friend even says, like, that monkey in a cage that she wanted to buy for her husband. I had such a strong suspicion that she went out looking for that day that I went and showed her pictures at, like, local convenience stores, and one of the convenience stores said that she was there. But again, I couldn't back this up anywhere. There's no mention of like surveillance footage. Like, where was she going at 111? Like, she didn't have any plans. My head's spinning.
Right, and it's not like she could even pick her kids up from school.
Now, police say that Pat's case is still open. They aren't ruling out anything at this point, and they're actively working to help bring closure to the Viola family. But at the end of the day, nothing can truly bring them closure. Jim, Christine, and Michael are still waiting for the answers to the questions that have kept them up at night for over 20 years. You can find all the source material for this episode on our website, crimejunkiepodcast.com.
And be sure to follow us on Instagram at Crime Junkie Podcast.
We'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Crime Junkie is an Audio Chuck production. So, what do you think, Chuck? Do you approve? Hi, Crime Junkies. I'm your host, Ashley Flowers.
And I'm Britt.
And we already brought you one full-length episode this week, but when a fan reached out and asked us to help her tell her own story, I had to put out an extra episode just for this, because for years, one of our own crime junkies, Sherry Snyder, has been doing everything she can to find out what happened to her missing mother. It hasn't been easy for her because she has almost nothing to go off of. No one knows exactly when her mom went missing, and she's been trying to piece together this story, one interview and police report at a time from a decade away. What she needs now is your help to get the word out. This is the story of Diane Francis. By the time Sherry Snyder realizes that her mom, Diane Francis, is missing, she's already at a severe disadvantage because it's been years since anyone has heard from Diane, and even longer since Sherry herself has seen her. You see, Diane struggled with substance use disorder, which led to her losing custody of her children multiple times. By the time Sherry was 10 in 2003, she and her sister were permanently removed from Diane's care, and they spent the next 5 or 6 years bouncing around between foster homes and shelters. Some were good and some were bad. Their only saving grace was the fact that they managed to stay together.
I was that kid that was like, if you tried to separate me from my sister, good luck having peace in your life ever again. Because I was the kid that was holding on to poles outside my school, screaming. I would just cry and cry and cry. I mean, I was crying to the point till I got sick.
During that time, they weren't given any information about their mom, and they didn't have any kind of visitation with her either. But in 2008, when the girls are teenagers and close to aging out of the system, Sherry decided to try and make contact with someone from her family. Now, she couldn't just ask for help. I mean, at the time, they were staying in a shelter that actually had strict rules against contacting biological families. So Sherry had to sneak a phone book out of one of the offices, and she spent the night looking for names of her relatives. She found her step-grandmother, Diane's father's wife. And when she was able to actually speak with her, the whole family was shocked to learn that the shelter the girls were staying in was just right around the corner from their grandparents' house. So not long after that late-night phone call, they were actually able to go live with their family, one of their aunts, and they got to be around a ton of their relatives. Though obviously the person that they wanted to see the most was their mom, Diane.
So is that even possible in this case? I've worked in the foster care and adoption system, and sometimes every case can be different. Sometimes they are allowed to have contact with biological family members, sometimes they aren't, and it sounds like the rights were terminated, which can complicate things even more.
Well, honestly, it's kind of a moot point because as badly as Sherry wanted to see her mom, Diane was actually nowhere to be found. Sherry and her sister hadn't seen Diane since they were permanently removed in 2003. But what was really concerning was that when Sherry started talking to her family and extended family about her mom around 2010, she learned that the rest of them had no idea where Diane could be.
So at that point, how long had Diane been MIA?
Well, Sherry's grandfather told her that he remembered getting a call from Diane in 2006, although I think just based on the research material that's out there, it's possible it might have actually been 2005. So by the time Sherry finds out, it's been a while. I mean, literally years since anyone has laid eyes or ears on Diane.
And had anyone reported Diane missing?
Well, relatives told Sherry that they had tried to have Diane declared missing, but no police agency would take a report. And Sherry ran into that issue as she tried doing the same thing, calling around to police departments in the areas in Florida that her mother might have last been in, specifically Melbourne, Palm Bay, and Jacksonville. Mostly, she said all she got was laughed at, which truly is just a genuinely horrible way to treat someone in her situation.
Yeah, that's awful.
She was told basically, listen, your mom's a grown woman. She hasn't been in the area as far as we know for years. Nothing we can do about it. So, like we often see when someone goes missing and police won't take it seriously, Sherry had to start her own investigation. She did this by trying to retrace her mother's steps. And to do that, she had to go all the way back to her own childhood, trying to remember everything about her mom, their life, and the people in it before Sherry and her sister were placed into the system. In 1994, Sherry's father Charles and Diane moved from New Jersey to Melbourne, Florida with Sherry and Sherry's older sister. Diane wanted to be in Florida so that she could live closer to her own father. But not long after the family relocated, Diane and Charles's relationship fell apart. Here is Sherry, who spoke with one of our reporters, Nina.
My father claims within a year, they moved into this trailer park, and within a year, she was kind of mingling with the man from across the trailer park.
After that, Charles moved back to New Jersey. Diane actually stayed in Melbourne, which is about an hour southeast of Orlando, and she started dating that other man. But in 1996, Sherry and her sister were removed from Diane's care. A report from the Florida Department of Children and Families says that Diane and her boyfriend were abusing crack cocaine at the time. There's this one instance where he and Diane dropped the girls and his son off at a friend's house for the night and just didn't get in touch with them until well into the next day. At the time, Sherry's sister had cut her knee so bad that it required stitches, and basically Diane and her boyfriend were nowhere to be found. And unfortunately, this was a pattern of parenting that would repeat for years and get the attention of authorities. Sherry says it was always a cycle of ups and downs.
There was always spurts of her getting better. So off the drugs, she went through the classes, she did the 12-step program or whatever it was she had to do to get us back, because there was requirements through the courts in order for her to regain custody. She would get on track, she'd be doing well, she'd be gaining weight, and then she'd lose us again, or like the drugs would take over her again. And so we'd just be right back in foster care or with family. There was 3 times legally, like on paper, that she went through the steps to get us back. And there was voluntary times where she had given us to her parents or her brother prior to us ever being taken away as well. So this was a common thing. She just kept returning to that lifestyle.
Diane and her boyfriend ultimately split up, and in 1997, she meets another man. We're going to use his nickname, JT. Sherry says JT had just gotten out of prison, and Diane had actually been dating a friend of his who managed some apartments that JT's family owned. That's how they knew each other.
So she gets with him and things are okay. You know, they have a safe place to live, obviously, because the courts let us go back into her care.
But things weren't okay for long.
He was completely and utterly abusive to my mother. Like, he would choke her out right in front of my sister and I, and we would jump on him and try to punch him and, you know, just like yanking on his hair and screaming. I remember him throwing my mom across the house. My sister and I ran over to her and like dragged her off into the bedroom and closed the door and locked it. And he was still outside the door screaming and yelling, and he punched his fist through the door.
Diane denied the abuse to police for a bunch of reasons, including the fact that she wanted to keep a roof over her and her daughter's heads. But one night in 1999, Diane and JT got into a fight, so she left their place. She was walking down the road in Melbourne after the argument, crying, when a man named Roger pulled over to ask if she was okay. Diane told him about the fight and the fact that she had nowhere to go.
And where were Sherry and her sister at this point?
So at the time of this, they were actually living with relatives. But that changes after Diane and Roger, this, again, guy who just picks her up on the side of the road, started dating. Roger had actually fought to get custody of his own son, so he helped Diane navigate the family court system. And before Sherry knew it, she and her sister were sent back to live with their mom. Sherry says that she has some happy memories from her childhood, including when she and her sister lived with her mom, Roger, and his son. Because here's the thing, when her mom was sober, she was wonderful. She was super funny with this like quirky sense of humor, and she liked to keep everyone laughing. She said she was just so vivacious and fun to be around. But again, those good times never lasted very long. In 2003, Diane relapsed again, and this is when Sherry and her sister were removed from Diane's care for good. So that was the last thing Sherry knew for sure. Now she had to try to piece together the last 7 years of her mom's life and movements to try and find out where she could be now. When she started asking around to try and figure out the last time anyone had actually heard from her mom, Sherry's grandfather, remember he said he talked to her in what he thought was 2006? Well, he said that Diane had called their house the Thanksgiving of 2006 in Jacksonville, Florida, specifically at a Ramada Inn. But that surprised Sherry.
We never knew her to be in Jacksonville. That's why I was surprised when I heard about that.
So was she just calling because of the holiday, like to check in? Did she seem okay?
Actually, she was calling because apparently she wanted her birth certificate and social security card. Sherry's grandfather says that he sent the documents, but at some point when he called the hotel back, it was closed. And then at some point it's reopened under like a completely different brand. And it was sometime after this that's when her family really tried to report her missing. But again, no one would take the reports. Because, you see, in police's minds, not only was she a grown adult who could walk away from her life if she wanted to, but they knew she lived a high-risk lifestyle. At some point, she had been engaging in sex work to support herself and her addiction. Sherry actually tried to use this to her advantage, hoping that there would be some kind of paper trail for her mother if she had run-ins with the law. But it got complicated because Diane had a couple of aliases that she used, including Diane Teresa Foreman and Kimberly Teresa Foreman. Foreman was actually one of her ex-boyfriend's last name, but Sherry says that as far as she knows, that man and her mother never actually got married. She just apparently used his last name sometimes. But even though it was complicated, it doesn't mean all of her efforts were in vain. Sherry was able to track down a few reports, and one gives her proof of her mom's last contact with police. But it actually adds more questions to the family's last recollections of contact with Diane. Based on what she found, the last time her mom was arrested, under any name that we know of, was on Sunday, November 27, 2005. Diane was charged with trespassing and resisting arrest at that Ramada Inn.
Which is why you said that even though Sherry's grandfather said that he talked to her in 2006, it's more than likely it was actually 2005, right?
Right. Like, we have this report from 2005 at this Ramada Inn, which he knows she was at. So, again, the paper trail says that was the last time, unless she just so happened to be in the same place a year later. According to the police report for that incident, a security guard heard a loud argument coming from one of the rooms, and when he went to go check it out, he recognized Diane. She had been in trouble for trespassing there before. Now, that report mentions that there is a man who's also there with Diane, who she refers to as her husband, but we're not sure who this guy is. On the report, there's no address listed for Diane, just as transient. And she's ultimately taken to jail and released the next day on November 28th, 2005. And that was it. That is the last known, again, physical paper trail contact that she has with police. It ends all right there in Jacksonville in 2005. Now, to go kind of back to your point about this, was she last heard from in 2005 or 2006? Again, we have Sherry's grandfather saying 2006. We have this report from 2005. And when we talk to Sherry herself, she says that her mother would never go that long without some sort of contact with police, like based on the reports that she has. So again, not only would she have not had made contact with her family for a year, but she would have also managed to stay out of trouble for a full year too, if that, talk in 2006 is correct. So Sherry keeps trying to fill in the pieces. She submitted a public records request in all of the cities she knew that her mom had gone to. She hunted down mugshots and traffic citations and police reports. She got copies of the Child Protective Services and foster care records that she was allowed to have. And once she found out about the arrests in Jacksonville, she even contacted the security guard at the Ramada Inn who called the cops on her mother. She reached out to everyone she could think of, every ex-boyfriend, every relative, every friend she could find who knew her mother. She even spoke with Roger, who claimed that he last saw Diane possibly in 2005 when he dropped her off at a house not far from where they used to live with a guy named JP, who is not to be confused with JT. Roger says that JP was basically a pimp, and the only description of him Sherry was able to get is that he's Hispanic, which is, again, very vague and no way to track him down just based on that. But here's what's strange. Roger also told Sherry that he didn't know Diane was ever in Jacksonville, which is so hard to wrap my head around because she was in Jacksonville around the time Roger is saying that he dropped her off at JP's place. We know that from reports. So if they were together around that time, why doesn't he know about Jacksonville?
Right.
Sherry asked him specifically about that because it was weird to her too. And he's like, listen, look, your mom was all over the place. I don't know. So it's kind of like a non-answer. Time and time again, Sherry's efforts led to dead ends and frustration. That is until Sherry called the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office in 2018. After the usual runaround, she heard back from a woman who works there, who quite literally gave her the shock of her life.
She's like, so the reason why they had me call you back is because I have this report from 2015. And I'm like, what? The last I've known about my mom is possibly 2006.
Sherry is stunned, even more so when she gets a look at the incident report, which is not about Diane getting arrested or anything like that. On May 11th, 2015, JT, Diane's ex-boyfriend, called the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office to try and report her missing.
What?
Yeah, he told police that he was the stepfather of Diane's children. He said that her last known residence was in Jacksonville and that he hasn't seen her in 12 years, which means by his account that he last saw her in 2003, which is just a few years after they broke up. There's also information in the report about Diane's last arrest in 2005 and her aliases, but I don't know if police found that stuff out on their own or if JT gave it to them.
Ashley, I have so many questions.
So does Sherry, starting with the fact that police could have actually looked at JT's criminal history when he called in, which included multiple domestic violence arrests. So why wouldn't police be like a little more concerned about him reporting a woman missing?
A woman missing that he hasn't seen in 12 years.
I never got that they literally let her abuser call in to try to report her missing and didn't tell anyone, didn't say anything, nothing.
Our reporter Nina tried to contact JT, but none of the phone numbers listed for him worked, and he never responded to our attempt to reach him through Facebook. But Sherry actually did talk to him a while back and asked him why he tried to make this report in 2015. And he said he just missed Diane.
So his first move is to call the cops?
I guess so. What's interesting is that a guy named George Contos, who lived right near JT in Flagler County, Florida, was reported missing in May that year by his family. Apparently, he was last seen just 1 or 2 days before JT called the police about Diane. And Sherry mentioned that to JT when they spoke. She was like, "Oh, that's so weird that your neighbor also goes missing." And JT told her that drug dealers fed George to the alligators.
Okay, then.
Now, police did name 2 suspects in George's case, neither of whom are JT. But again, Sherry just thought that the coincidence or the timing of this all was just super weird. Like maybe JT was fishing for information from law enforcement, like that's why he's calling to report someone missing to see if there's anything else going on. I don't know.
Can we back up just for a second? Why was JT able to report her missing, but her own family wasn't?
Well, actually, he wasn't able to report her missing. That call that he made in 2015 was the end of it. It's just an incident report that has Diane's name on it, not like an official missing persons report. Because
so it's just like someone saying like, hey, there's this guy looking for this woman, and stop.
Right, because Diane Francis is not officially reported missing until 2019. That's when Sherry finds a sympathetic detective in the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office who is actually willing to take the report.
Even though we don't think her to have ever been in West Palm Beach, it was just a way to get my DNA into the NCIC system and make sure that it's on record in case she is ever found.
Having her mother officially reported missing was a huge victory to Sherry, but it hasn't slowed down her investigation.
So to have her go 17 years almost without contacting a friend, a boyfriend, a relative, her kids, anybody. It's not just me. It's anyone. She hasn't spoken to anyone. I couldn't see her just disappearing off the face of the planet completely. I couldn't see her doing better or changing her life around and not making my sister and I a part of that. Because whenever she was doing better, that's when we were a part of her life.
There's 2 theories that Sherry can't get out of her head. One is that JT was involved in her mom's disappearance.
In my mind, I always had a thought that he could have gone back and hurt her somehow because I saw the abuse, what I witnessed as a little child.
And another theory involves a man named Russell Tillis. Just last year, in 2021, Tillis was convicted of kidnapping and murdering a woman named Joni Gunter. According to Action News Jack, Joni's dismembered body was found buried in his yard in 2016. He lived in Jacksonville, and actually his home, which his neighbors dubbed the House of Horrors, was just a few minutes' drive from that Ramada Inn where Diane was spending time at. After Russell was arrested, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office had a news conference, and the assistant chief told the media, quote, "We believe it's highly likely that other females were victimized by Tillis, including potentially other murders," end quote. Police say that Russell targeted vulnerable young women with a history of sex work and drug use. And get this, according to the Daily Beast, Russell's neighbors described witnessing sex workers running naked from Russell's house, banging on doors and screaming for help.
Oh my God, I mean, this gives me such like Lisk flashbacks too.
The neighbors even claimed to see a woman chained to his fence one night, and they called the cops, but the Daily Beast couldn't find a police report on that incident. I mean, either way, it's just wild, and it's haunting to Sherry.
So to think that my mom was prostituting right in that area when he killed that girl is just like, I cannot get that off my mind now.
Sherry has been in touch with law enforcement working that case, who sent her a picture of a Polaroid that they found in Russell's house, and the person in the photo looks a lot like her mom. But, we know police did search the house, and it's actually been leveled at this point, and they didn't find any other bodies on the property. All Sherry wants is to find the mother she remembers.
I knew my mom. And they'll all say, you didn't know the bad part of her. You didn't, no, I did. I remember. It still doesn't make her worth any less finding. It really doesn't. And it never will. This will always be my fight. I remember, in the midst of all of the, drug-induced passing out and just having to care for ourselves, I do remember the love my mom had for my sister and I. And so I think that's what keeps me going with all this.
When Diane was last heard from, she was 37 to 38 years old. She was white with blonde or brown hair and brown hazel eyes. She stood about 5'3" and was 100 to 120 pounds. She does have a distinctive tattoo of a heart on her left calf, a tattoo of the letters JT on her right arm, and scars on both her arms and her face. She may go by her middle name Teresa, or use the alias names Diane Teresa Foreman, or even Kimberly Teresa Foreman. So Crime Junkies, Sherry is asking for all of our help. This investigation is still pretty much resting on her shoulders alone. And she wants to actually make a trip to Florida, where her mom was last known to be, to actually look for her. So she has a GoFundMe that we're going to put the link to in our show notes and on our blog. A few bucks from each of you would go a long way. And anyone with information about Diane can call the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office at 561-688-3000. And if you or someone you know is a victim of domestic violence, help is available. The number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline is right in our show notes, 1-800-799-SAFE. You can find all of the source material for this episode on our website, crimejunkiepodcast.com.
And as always, check us out on Instagram at crimejunkiepodcast.
We'll be back next week with another episode. Crime Junkie is an Audio Chuck production. So, what do you think, Chuck? Do you approve? Hi, Crime Junkies. I'm your host, Ashley Flowers.
And I'm Britt.
And the story I have for you today is about a woman whose disappearance is a mystery that keeps unfolding while a family desperately searches for answers. This is the story of Lauren DeMolo. It's Friday night, June 19, 2020, and when Paul DeMolo's phone rings, he answers it, and he's surprised to hear his daughter's boyfriend, Gabriel Pena, on the other line. Paul isn't close with Gabriel, or Gabby as he's called, even though he and Paul's daughter Lauren have been dating for years. In fact, they haven't even met yet. Gabby and Lauren live in Cape Coral, which is in Southwest Florida, and Paul actually lives across the country in California. But this isn't a social call. According to a police report Paul gave us, Gabby tells Paul that he got home from work that night, like normal, around 10 p.m., but Lauren was nowhere to be found. And here's Paul, who spoke with one of our reporters, Lena.
He said he kissed her goodbye in the morning, went to work, came home, she's not there. And I was like, all right, well, did you go out looking for her? Maybe she had her mom's house. Did she go to the store to buy cigarettes?
Paul's not freaking out right away. I mean, Lauren isn't a teenager. She's almost 30. So he tells Gabby to have Lauren call him when she gets home, figuring that he's going to hear from her soon. So he waits and waits, but the call never comes. By Saturday, Paul still hasn't heard a word from his daughter. So he calls Gabby at work.
And I was like, did Lauren come home? He goes, no, I didn't see her. I said, I'm starting to get worried.
Lauren's sister Cassie reaches out to the Cape Coral Police Department and asks them to do a wellness check at the apartment. The police send an officer over to check it out, but no one answers the door. And at this point, they really don't have any probable cause that's going to allow them to go in uninvited, break the door down.
Right. So has Gabby been looking for Lauren during this time, or is he just kind of business as usual, or just kind of keeping his cool like her dad was?
Well, when Paul talks to Gabby a few hours later that afternoon, Gabby mentions that he did look for Lauren in a couple of places once he got off work, but he couldn't find her. And I think at this point, they're all kind of hoping there's still a chance that she's just going to walk through the door. But if she does come home that night, Gabby won't know because he mentions to Paul that he isn't going to stay at her place that night like he does most nights. He's actually planning to go to a friend's house instead.
That's kind of odd. I mean, shouldn't this guy be concerned enough to stick around the apartment to see if she comes home?
Well, Paul wonders the same thing. Now that brings us to Sunday, June 21st, which is Father's Day, and there is still no sign of Lauren. And not hearing from her is weird because Paul has basically raised Lauren and her sisters as a single dad in Maryland until Lauren was older and she went to stay with her mom in Florida. But even after she moved, she and Paul remained super close. So as the day drags on and he still doesn't hear from her, he knows something is seriously wrong, especially because her family knows that just a few days ago on the 18th, so we're talking literally the day before Paul thinks Lauren is missing, Lauren had been released from a mental health facility for the second time that month. Both times she was admitted, it was involuntary, and she was able to be admitted that way under a law called the Florida Baker Act. According to reporting by Caitlin Greenapple of the Fort Myers News Press, the Baker Act essentially allows families and officials to provide emergency mental health services and temporary detention for up to 72 hours if a person is considered a threat to themselves or to others.
Okay, so why was Lauren controlled?
Well, she had recently been experiencing paranoia, hallucinations, and symptoms of psychosis, which had never happened to her before. She was hospitalized for the first time on June 1st because according to what Paul was told by the facility, Lauren had jumped into a lake, the Bimini Basin, which is right next to a park that she liked to visit called Four Freedoms Park. And I guess she jumped in because she thought something or someone was after her. Now, Lauren did struggle with substance use disorder. After she got in a car accident in her late teens, she became addicted to the opioid painkillers that she was prescribed, and eventually she started using heroin. She had stopped for a while, but then relapsed. And Lauren's drug use had led to her losing custody of her young daughter, Michaela, which devastated her. But her family says that it had also motivated her to make some serious life changes. Michaela was living a couple of hours away with her grandmother, and Lauren's main goal in life was getting her back. So she stopped using heroin. So the time that we're talking about, June of 2020, Paul says that she had been off the drug for nearly 2 years. So that's not contributing to her acting this way. She did smoke marijuana occasionally, but Paul had never known Lauren to use anything that would cause a side effect like the ones the hospital described to her. Anyway, Lauren was hospitalized for a week that first time, and shortly after they admitted her, they did a drug screen which only showed the opioid blockers, Suboxone, and THC in her system. But Paul wondered if maybe Lauren had been drugged with something that the toxicology screen maybe missed, or, maybe was out of her system by then. I mean, the whole incident just seemed so out of the ordinary. Plus, Lauren didn't even seem to remember it very well, so her family was just bewildered. After she was released from the facility, Paul was trying to plan a trip from California to visit her. But this was legit right at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and there were travel restrictions everywhere, especially for people living in or trying to travel from California.
Right.
Now, soon after Lauren was released from her first hospital stay, she was involuntarily admitted again for 3 days this time because she started having some of the same symptoms.
I mean, are they thinking that she's having some sort of mental break?
Actually, Actually, according to a podcast about Lauren's disappearance called Complicit, Lauren had recently been pregnant and had an abortion in late May of that year. And I guess medical staff at the hospital determined that she experienced a temporary psychosis due to a chemical imbalance resulting from the procedure.
So when they can't find or get a hold of Lauren, is her family thinking that maybe she's, going through one of these episodes again, having hallucinations and stuff?
Well, I mean, it probably crossed their minds because they knew that Lauren wouldn't just be MIA on her own. I mean, plus her sister Cassie talked to her on Thursday around like 6:30 p.m. and Lauren was worried that she might lose her job at Taco Bell because of all the days she had missed while she was in the hospital. So Cassie was going to help her apply for unemployment benefits. And they were going to do that the next day, which is all the more reason that they believe she wouldn't just walk off on her own. But that next day came and went and Cassie never heard from her sister. So by Sunday, it's been almost 3 days since anyone in her family has spoken with her. Paul contacts Gabby again and tells him to go to Lauren's apartment, call police, and let them come in and search the place. Remember, they can't just break down the door, but let them in, see what they can find. But Gabby tells Paul that he doesn't have access to a car, so he can't go right away. He's gonna have to wait for a guy named Victor to give him a ride. Victor and Gabby know each other because they work together at a flooring company, but they're more than just co-workers. You see, Victor is actually the longtime boyfriend of Lauren's mom, who's named Laura.
So he's almost like a father.
Yeah, I mean, because again, they've been dating for years, so they know each other well. Now, on Paul's end, a couple of hours pass with no news, so he calls Gabby again. Gabby tells him that, yeah, they went to the apartment, yes, they contacted the police, but the police just never showed up, which is totally unacceptable to Paul. So he calls the...
And to me.
Yeah, so he calls the police, and he's like, what the heck? And they're like, whoa, 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 we never got any call. I'm not sure who's telling you what, but you're not getting the real story. So Paul calls Gabby back and confronts him, and Gabby passes all the blame onto Victor, saying that he didn't want to get police involved.
Okay, that's sus.
Yeah, and by now, Paul is fed up. He tells Gabby something like, get over to the police department, I don't care how you get there, walk, crawl, whatever, and file a police report now. And I want the case number. So finally, Gabby goes down to the Cape Coral police station to file a report. Paul shared a copy of Gabby's statement with us from that report, and according to the document, Gabby tells police the same thing that he told Paul, that he spent Thursday night at the apartment with Lauren and saw her when he left for work Friday morning. But then when he got back that night around 10 p.m., she just wasn't there. And he said that he tried calling police before this, but that they had told him he had to wait 48 hours to report her missing. According to NBC2 News, he tells police that Lauren had not made any statements indicating that she wanted to harm herself or anyone else, and she wasn't on any medication.
Oh, okay, wait, back up. Is it true about what he said about calling police, that they said that you have to wait those 48 hours because, again, the stupidest rule in the world?
So here's the thing. Paul says that he asked Cape Coral police about that, and he was told that Gabby did not call them on Friday night.
What?
Yeah, and all of this would be cause for major concern under the best circumstances. But Paul has even more of a reason to be worried. Just recently, Lauren had confided something in him that he says she had been keeping a secret for a while. Lauren had called her dad in tears on May 22nd, 2020. That was the day that she had had the abortion. Lauren's family knew that having an abortion was a really difficult decision for her to make, but she was already trying to get custody of her daughter, who was about to turn 6, and she said she wasn't financially stable enough to bring another child into the world. And they understood. They wanted to support her. But when she called to tell her dad about this, he learned something else that was very troubling.
I'm like, what's the matter, kid? She goes, Dad, I had the abortion today, and Gabby came home from work, and I was sitting on the couch, and I didn't feel good. So I asked him if he would get me, just a bowl of soup. And instead, this is what he did to me, and she took pictures and sent them to me for the first time ever of where he beat her.
This was the first time Paul had heard of Gabby being abusive.
She always told me the guy treated her like a queen. She didn't want to tell me that this was going on because she knew I would go down there.
Now, this whole time, Lauren's family is waiting by the phone. But Monday passes with no word from her or the police. So they start mobilizing. Her other sister, Lindsay, manages to get a spare key to Lauren's apartment from their mother. It was actually Gabby's key that he had left with Lauren's mom and Victor. So Cassie and Lindsay's boyfriend, Matt, go to Lauren's apartment on Tuesday, June 23rd. Nothing seems out of the ordinary. There are no signs of a struggle, no signs of a disturbance. They do find a cell phone, but they can't tell if it's Lauren's, and it's not working anyway. But they want the cops to come in and check the place out, so they contact the department again. And then something happens that Cassie says changes everything.
They're waiting for the police to come. Gabby showed up and was like, oh, I'm here to get my TV because obviously she's not coming back.
After that remark, her family is understandably on edge. But their concern grows when Gabby comes out of Lauren's apartment with a cell phone in his hand. It's Lauren's phone. It's the one that she'd been using since she was released from the mental health facility in early June. Gabby says that it was in the apartment, and Cassie notices that it's fully charged, like 100% battery.
So, did they just miss it, or are you saying he probably had it the entire time?
We don't know. Both are a possibility, but neither of those scenarios are good because her family can't imagine a scenario where Lauren would leave and leave her phone behind.
Wait, why did Gabby even show up while they were there in the first place? Like, if he gave his key to Lauren's mom, how did he know that they were there to even let him in?
Well, Paul says that Gabby was supposed to be at work at this time, so he thinks that maybe Lauren's mother told him that they were there, so that
he kind of like gave him a heads up?
Right. So eventually, police arrive to the apartment responding to Cassie's call, and she lays out all of her concerns. She already doesn't feel like the police are taking this seriously, but then she learns something shocking. There hasn't actually even been a detective assigned to this case yet. In fact, nobody's been working on it.
Okay, what? So, just to be clear, like, her feeling that no one was taking this seriously at the police department
is actually quite a fact.
Yeah, like, no one was actually taking this, maybe not seriously, but no one was working it at all?
Yeah, I guess police tell Cassie there was some kind of clerical error with how the report was put into their system, like sometime on Sunday when the report was filed. So apparently Lauren is technically reported missing, but she's not reported as endangered missing. And the only person who can fix the clerical error just happens to be out of office.
Okay, I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, one, there should be two people, and what is it, like a checkbox? Like,
baffling. So even now, when they're like, oh my gosh, there's this mistake, this person's out of office. So it's not until the next day, Wednesday, June 24th, that police assign a detective, this guy named Nick Jones, to the case.
You know what I would have done? I would have assigned him and just left that person who was out of office a Post-it note and said that I did it. Just gonna be honest.
Yeah, I think a Post-it note would have solved it. And according to Wink News, police also put out a BOLO for her and elevated Lauren's case to finally an endangered missing person. And they did this because she didn't take any of her belongings like her cell phone or her clothes. The first alert about Lauren's disappearance says that she was last seen on June 19, 2020, wearing a t-shirt and shorts in the 4900 block of Coronado Parkway, which is the block that her apartment complex is on. But by this time, it's been practically a full week since anyone in Lauren's family has heard from her. And obviously, that's a huge disadvantage. So the best police can do is start canvassing the neighborhood, getting info from her family, gathering data from Lauren's electronic devices to try and help them track down her movements in the days and hours leading up to her disappearance. Meanwhile, Paul gets to Florida on Wednesday night, and as police conduct their investigation, Lauren's friends and family launch their own. And right away, their efforts pay off. On Thursday, June 25th, Paul, Cassie, and some other relatives go over to Lauren's apartment. Outside of her front door, they find some acrylic fingernails, a metal shower curtain cup, and an earring. Now, the fingernails are orange, and according to People magazine, they look just like the design Lauren had in a recent Facebook photo that she posted.
Hold up. How did all of those things get missed? I mean, the police have already been there, plus her sisters and Gabby.
I don't know. Like, this one makes my mind hurt because, like you said, you would think police had gone to search the apartment, that not only are they searching inside, you think that they would check outside? So
Well, and like, even sisters, like, I'm thinking, like, as a sister, I would think of something that would be, like, so tied to my sister's fashion choices, or, like, orange. That's gonna stand out. You're gonna see it, right? That's baffling.
I don't know. But in the end, Cassie says that, once she notices this, that police do come and collect it after she lets them know about it. But the family doesn't even stop there. They visit the local bus stop and speak with the people who regularly ride the bus that Lauren used to take. But they haven't even seen Lauren for the last, week. So the next stop they make is the Taco Bell she had worked at. And they find out that she never picked up her last paycheck, which for someone living paycheck to paycheck just doesn't happen.
Plus, it's more proof that she didn't just skip town because, money is kind of helpful to do something like that.
Right. Over the next few days, they talk to her friends and people who live near her apartment. They organize searches, they hand out flyers, they post on social media, anything they can think to do to get the word out to bring Lauren home. And actually, Four Freedoms Park, the spot Lauren liked to go near Bimini Basin, becomes kind of the hub of a lot of this activity. Four Freedoms is a popular spot with residents. There are events, concerts, there's a beach, a playground, and Lauren went there all the time to meditate. It's within walking distance of her apartment, which was important to her since she doesn't have a driver's license or a car. And it's also right across the street from her mom and Victor's place, so it was a super convenient spot for her. So knowing how much time she spent there, her family makes searching it a regular part of their routine. They go multiple times a day to look for any clues that they can find, and they even give interviews to the media there. On Saturday, June 27th, Paul and Cassie head to Four Freedoms, like usual, and that's when they learn that police are also focusing on that area. The Cape Coral PD has its dive team there in the basin next to the park, the same basin that Lauren had apparently jumped in earlier that month. And Detective Jones told them that they're searching the basin and the canals for Lauren. When her family asks why police are searching in that area, they're shocked to find out that Lauren's purse and her shoes had been found in Four Freedoms Park back on June 19th.
What?
Yeah, Cape Coral police says that a homeless man had found it on a table under a gazebo in Kingdom Inn. On an episode of Investigation Discovery's In Pursuit of the Missing, Detective Jones says that he learned about the purse being found when he was first assigned to the case, which was actually one of the big reasons Lauren's designation was elevated to endangered missing person. Everything was still in there, her wallet, her ID, her keys. The only thing that wasn't in there was her cell phone, which Gabby says, remember, when he came later, he found in the apartment. But Jones says that's not the only major lead that they've been following up on. Police, I guess, were out canvassing the neighborhood when they went into a gas station to ask if anyone had seen Lauren. And a clerk tells them, yeah, I know her, and she was here just a few days ago filling out a job application. Sure enough, surveillance footage from the Speedway gas station, less than a half mile from her apartment, shows Lauren around 11:40 a.m. on Thursday, June 18th. Now, that was within just a couple of hours of her getting released from the mental health facility. And, remember, she was worried about her employment situation. She thought she was going to lose her job at Taco Bell because of how long she'd been in the hospital. So, really, she got out and she went right to work looking for a job. In the footage, she seems to be okay. She's smiling, she's joking around with the clerk who gives her the application. You can see that she's wearing a pink shirt and black pants. And according to NBC2 News, the purse that she's carrying is the same one that was found in the park the next day on the 19th. But that's not all. Detective Jones told Investigation Discovery that an area maintenance worker at her and Gabby's apartment building saw Lauren around 8 a.m. on Friday, June 19th. She was apparently walking from Four Freedoms Park back to her apartment. Now, there are a few different narratives out there about this guy. According to Wink News, the man said that not only did he see Lauren that Friday morning, he also spoke with her the day before on June 18th. He said that Lauren had asked him if there were any apartments available in the area and told him that she, quote, wanted to get out of the situation she was in, end quote. Now, to be clear, he's not identified as a maintenance man in that news story, but it's possible we're talking about the same guy because according to NBC2 News, there are reports that a maintenance worker at Lauren's apartment complex spoke with her at some point Friday morning and that she had asked him if he knew of any cheap apartments in the area. And this whole thing is really odd to her family because they knew that Lauren had just paid her rent. Why is she looking for something right away?
Right.
And Lauren's sister Cassie says a maintenance guy named Tim, who works at a completely different apartment complex nearby, not Lauren's, reported seeing Lauren on Friday around 8:15 a.m. walking from Four Freedoms Park to her apartment. But Cassie also says there's no hard evidence that Lauren was seen at all that morning or any time on Friday. We just have these couple of eyewitness statements that we can't prove. And really, her family thinks it's possible that Lauren went missing on the night of Thursday the 18th, sometime between when Cassie last spoke with her and Friday morning. And I don't know if this means anything. It might just be something I'm reading into a little bit too much, but when police put out a longer statement about Lauren's disappearance, which is a few days after that first alert, they say now that she was last seen at her apartment.
Now, to me, that sounds a little bit different than when they initially said that she was last seen, like, on the block that her complex was on.
Right. Again, I don't know how much to read into that or if they were just being vague before, but they always thought it was her apartment. I don't know. Now, meanwhile, there's friction building between the police and Paul, who's frustrated about the progress of the investigation. But the family makes sure to give police all the information they can. And that includes sharing everything they know about Lauren, including stuff that they were learning as they tried to retrace her steps. By all accounts, Lauren was a kind, generous, and giving person, the type of person who would do anything for the people she loved. She had a huge, infectious smile and a knack for cheering people up when they were down. And above all else, she loved being a mom to include. But we know she also had her struggles. She hung out with people that her sister Cassie calls unfavorable characters. And obviously her relationship with Gabby wasn't as happy as she pretended it was. They would often break up and then get back together. Paul finds out that Lauren had actually told some people that Gabby was abusive, although it seems like she kept it from many of the people that she was closest to, again, including her family, which is like a total secret. But there was something else that she hadn't shared with many people, including her family. Lauren actually wasn't sure who she'd gotten pregnant by this most recent time. Cassie finds out through a friend of Lauren's that while she and Gabby were on one of their off periods, Lauren had actually dated another guy, and she thought it was possible that she was pregnant by him.
She wasn't sure if it was Gabby's or someone else's, this guy called Crow, who's a big drug dealer. But from what I was told from one of the girls she works with, Lauren wasn't doing drugs, but she felt safe with Carl because Gabby was always beating up on her.
So did Gabby know about this other guy? Wait, honestly, let's back up. Did Gabby even know Lauren was pregnant or that she had an abortion at all?
Cassie says that they all talked about the situation together when she visited Lauren and Gabby on June 13th, just a few days before Lauren went missing.
Her and I talked about her abortion, and Gabby was there with us, and they were like, yeah, we just decided that, like, financially we're not in a good place to bring another child into the world. I'm fighting to bring Michaela home, and I feel like it wouldn't be fair to her for me to, like, have another baby.
And Paul thinks that Gabby did know about Carl. He says they found a journal of Lauren's in her apartment when they were cleaning it out, and Carl's address was written in the journal. But it was written not in Lauren's handwriting. They think it was written in handwriting that to them looks more like Gabby's. As June turns to July, her family doesn't give up hope. They stick to their routine, which includes daily searches of Four Freedoms Park, hoping to find some kind of clue that will lead them to Lauren. And so they're stunned when on July 2nd, during their second search of the park that day, not even of all time, but just that day, they find something half buried in the sand near the basin waterline. They found Lauren's shirt.
What?
Yep, Cassie immediately recognizes the burgundy lace shirt. It's unique, and Lauren wore it all the time. I mean, there are even recent pictures of her in the shirt on social media. But the real question everyone wants to know is, like, how did it get there?
That shirt wasn't there for 3 weeks. I was through this park. I did a news interview right in that same spot. And a newscast was right there, you know, with their cameras and tripods and everything. There was no shirt there. That shirt was planted there for whatever reason. And it was completely clean.
There are surveillance cameras in the park, and according to NBC2, detectives confirmed that they tried to pull footage to see when and how the shirt got there. But police tell Cassie that they can't determine much from the video.
They could be like from the night before, some guys picking around the sand, and then some guy pulls up the shirt and just leaves it there.
Okay, if there are cameras in the park, could they see who put the person's shoes there back on June 19th?
Apparently, I guess the place where her purse was found is actually right out of line of vision of the camera. Obviously, though, the park has become a focus point for police. In fact, they bring cadaver dogs in to search it on July 20th. But the cadaver dogs aren't interested in Four Freedoms Park. Instead, they lead police across the street to the home of Lauren's mother, Laura, and her boyfriend, Victor. The cadaver dogs alert on the van parked in Laura and Victor's driveway. This isn't just any van either. It's the one Gabby and Victor used for work. And Paul says that they would take the van home with them all the time. Gabby even had it with him when Lauren went missing. But the dogs aren't done. They keep going, leading investigators up the stairs to Victor and Laura's apartment, right to a curtain in front of their washer and dryer. Police take everything they come across in for forensic testing. Now, there was already a little bit of a divide in the family by the time the cadaver dogs showed up. It had been forming since Father's Day. I mean, remember, Victor was the one who apparently didn't want police involved in Lauren's disappearance that day. And I guess Cassie had also asked Victor to check Lauren's apartment while they were over there. So after he went, she asked him if he gave it a thorough search. You know, did you look in the closets, under the bed, everywhere? And Cassie says that Victor started making snarky comments and jokes at this point. I guess he compared his search to a Where's Waldo and told her that he even checked the fridge. And things just kept kind of like escalating over the past month. Like Laura and Victor hadn't helped in any of the search efforts to find Lauren, and they had been really protective of Gabby, who also hadn't joined in on any kind of search efforts. Apparently they were always defending him and telling Lauren's sisters what a good guy he is. So as you can imagine, this latest discovery, these dogs hitting on the apartment, doesn't exactly bring everyone closer together. And Victor and Laura and that side of the family feel like everyone is against them.
Okay, but this is a police investigation. It's not like Paul or Cassie made the dogs go over there.
Not only did they not make them go over there, apparently that side of the family didn't even know it was happening until later that day, let alone what the outcome would be. But ultimately, again, I don't even know if it matters, because what's wild is that the cadaver dog search doesn't even give police any evidence that they can use. Investigators tell the family the dogs actually made a mistake alerting to the van. Because of the fact that Victor and Gabby work with flooring, they say, I guess, the dogs could have picked up the scent of a carpet that might have been from a deceased person's home, or maybe throw out the idea of maybe menstrual blood. I don't know.
Okay, but what about the curtain?
Well, that's another disappointment. The forensic tests on that don't turn up anything. But not all is dead in this investigation, because meanwhile, police do manage to get some data off Lauren's phone, like locations and messages. Cassie says they find out the last text she ever sent was on Thursday night, June 18th. And it said, quote, "You guys coming?"
And who is it to?
Well, at first, police say they can't trace who the message was sent to because Lauren used an app to send it.
Like WhatsApp or Instagram or something like that?
So while that was the last message sent, they do see that Lauren's phone was last used around 10 a.m. on June 19th. That's when Lauren, or someone using her phone from her apartment, tried to Facebook video chat with Gabby. He didn't answer, and he says that he never even got that call. Now, speaking of Gabby, he gives a couple of interviews in the first few months of Lauren's disappearance. In July, he tells Wink News reporter Danielle Garcia that he doesn't think Lauren left voluntarily because she didn't take her clothes or toiletries. He also tells the reporter, quote, I'm worried and scared. Not scared because I didn't do anything, but I'm just worried something really did happen, end quote.
That's kind of an interesting statement.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot to unpack or read into.
Well, he says he has a theory of what might have happened. He thinks that Lauren went out with a friend, and that friend, quote, got her all messed up on drugs, and I don't know what after that, end quote. In August, he tells NBC2 News that he's been cooperating with investigators and that he passed a polygraph test. He says he has nothing to do with Lauren's disappearance and that he hasn't been able to take down any pictures of her in his apartment that they shared, hoping that she's still alive for her daughter's sake. At this point, he also has another theory to share. He thinks that Lauren might have been looking for another apartment for the two of them, and that, quote, maybe someone took advantage of that, and that was it, and never came back, end quote.
Okay, so those are two pretty different theories.
Yeah.
And he either believes she was drugged by someone or that someone showing her a new apartment did something to her.
Well, put all of that aside, what's interesting to me is that they weren't even living together anymore at the time that Lauren went missing.
That's right.
I mean, he obviously stayed there sometimes, and he had like a spare key that I mentioned, which was actually with her mom and Victor, but his name wasn't on the lease, and he used a different address when he filed the missing persons report to even report her missing. Now, obviously, police always need to look hard at a significant other in cases like this, and that's especially true here because there are allegations of domestic violence. Now, Gabby has never been charged with domestic violence in relation to Lauren, but he has been arrested for it in the past. According to records from the Lee County Court, he got into a fight in a parking lot of a grocery store with the woman that he was married to at the time. And even though he tried to blame her and say that she punched him, video surveillance showed that he was the aggressor. It looks like actually there was no resolution to the case. The records say that she didn't want to provide a sworn statement against him, which we know is very common in domestic violence cases.
So the charges basically were dropped.
Police say Gabby has been cooperative with Lauren's investigation. According to People magazine, police confirmed that Gabby passed a polygraph and has an alibi for June 19th. And they say there's no evidence linking him to Lauren's disappearance. Detective Jones told Investigation Discovery that police used phone records and GPS tracking to determine that Gabby was not even in Cape Coral at all during the day on June 19th. He was working at a construction site an hour away in Marco Island. The detective also said that while he was suspicious at first of Gabby's reluctance to report Lauren missing, Gabby told him it wasn't unusual for her to be out of touch with him for a couple of days. Plus, I guess Gabby's not even the only person of interest. Detective Jones named 3 other people that police have been investigating in connection to Lauren's disappearance, and one of them is Carl Crow. Carl is a convicted drug dealer and has been arrested a bunch of times. In fact, he was in jail when Lauren disappeared, which means that if he was involved with her disappearance, he had to have had help.
So do we know why he was in jail?
So according to the police, in April of 2020, a young woman named Kaylee Musso was found dead alongside of a road in Gator Circle, which is a neighborhood in Cape Coral. Her death was ruled an accidental overdose, but Carl was actually one of several people arrested in connection with her death. They were all arrested in May 2020. He was charged with tampering with evidence, mishandling human remains, and failure to report a death. According to Lee County court records, police found Kaylee's body wrapped in a white sheet and duct tape, and apparently there was a red folder next to her body with the name Thomas Bartley on it.
You've got to be kidding me.
No, so obviously you go looking for Thomas Bartley, right? And
Right.
Police find him, they confront him, which leads to the arrest of everyone who was in the house when Kaylee overdosed, including Carl. The court records say that Carl was doing drugs with Kaylee in his room, and that later, when the group realized she was dead, they all worked together to move her body, while Carl moved drugs in a safe out of his room in case police traced her death back to the house. Ultimately, Carl pled no contest to those charges in November of 2021, which means he accepted the conviction like it was a guilty plea, but didn't actually admit guilt. Now, according to the Complicit podcast, police suspect Carl organized Lauren's disappearance while he was in jail with the help from 2 of his associates who were not in jail at the time. And those 2 guys that are friends of Carl's, one is named Janero Jose Rivera, who seems to just go by Jose Rivera, and Joshua Okapal, who's friends with Jose. Detective Jones told Investigation Discovery that both men have extensive criminal records, and Josh is a registered sex offender. But that's not why police are suspicious of them. According to Complicit, the last text Lauren sent on Thursday, June 18th, the one that said, "You guys coming," was actually to Jose and Josh.
But I thought you said police couldn't trace him.
Well, I guess they couldn't at first, or maybe that's just what they told the family at first, I don't know. But obviously, this is huge. Even more damning is that a witness told Paul that Lauren was at Josh's apartment that Thursday night, and apparently Jose was there too. Now, Lauren did make it home that night as far as we know, since Gabby says that he last saw her that following morning. But police think that Josh might have been the last person to see Lauren. Josh lives near her apartment, and according to Detective Jones, he told police that he saw her on June 19th around 10 a.m. walking in front of his apartment complex. He says that they just said hi to each other. Now, all three of those men, Carl, Jose, and Josh, are in custody as of late November 2021. Carl and Jose are in for drug trafficking charges, and Josh for violating his probation. It's also worth noting that Cassie says police have also questioned their mother's boyfriend, Victor, multiple times. I'm not sure if this was before or after the cadaver dogs alerted on the van and the curtain, but something else that I think is bizarre, it's like worth noting, is something that happened not long after that search. According to Complicit, I guess Victor had gotten a text from like one of those spam numbers or whatever. He texts back the spam number a photo of Lauren, her sister Lindsay, and Lindsay's daughter. And then he shows this message to Lauren's brother and is like, hey, check out this text I got. I think someone's threatening us.
What?
Yeah, it's strange because Lauren's brother could easily tell from just looking at the phone that Victor is the one who actually sent the photo to the spam number, not the other way around. I guess he was trying to play it off like someone sent me this picture of them.
But like how text messages work is you can see who's like what's from who, right?
It's so weird.
That's super strange.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Victor told police, and as far as I could tell, like he's never really addressed that or even been confronted directly about any involvement. Again, I know he's talked to police, but none of that has been made public. Though he did do an interview with the Complicit podcast. And in that interview, he talked about Lauren and Gabby's relationship. And he says that Gabby told him Lauren had relapsed and was using drugs again, which he said was the reason for a lot of their arguments.
And had she actually relapsed?
Well, her family doesn't think so. Paul says that Lauren was always super open with him about her drug use. Like, even when she was ashamed of doing it, she would still admit it to him.
Well, and when she had tox screenings, when she had been admitted to the hospital, nothing had shown up there, right?
Right. So I guess, like, in my mind, if this is true, which not a lot of people seem to think it is, she would have had to have relapsed, like, literally the day she went missing. Victor said that Gabby told him that he and Lauren had a long talk on the night of June 18th, and they decided to try and work things out. Gabby never mentioned anything about Lauren going out that night, and when Gabby and Victor went to work that Friday morning on the 19th, Gabby told him that everything was good. The two of them worked a double shift, so they didn't get home until like 9 p.m., and Gabby took the work van over to Lauren to spend the night. But the next day, when Gabby picked Victor up for work, he told him that Lauren hadn't come home the night before, and that she was probably out getting high, and he was done with the relationship.
But then why did Gabby call Paul that night to say he was concerned?
I don't know, but Victor says that he doesn't think Gabby had anything to do with her disappearance. He also told the podcast that he wasn't sure why the cadaver dogs had come to his house, except that he had a cat that died there at some point. Although, from what I read about the training process, cadaver dogs are taught to distinguish between human and animal remains, so I don't know. The final thought that Victor has is that he thinks Lauren might still actually be alive, and he actually throws out the idea that she might be a possible victim of sex trafficking.
So, what about the father of Lauren's daughter, Michaela? Was he ever considered a suspect?
Paul says that he did consider that Lauren's daughter's father could have been involved. Police checked him out and said that it wasn't him. And that's really all I know. Like, I don't know the details of like what police found or how they ruled him out. But there was also another guy that Paul mentioned, a customer at the Taco Bell that Lauren was working at. I guess this guy is named Sandy, and he came in all the time when she was working and would ask her out, and she repeatedly told him that she wasn't interested. But what's really interesting about him is that I guess he stopped coming into the Taco Bell once Lauren went missing, but before her disappearance was reported to police. And for what feels like so many strong possibilities in this case, or at least strong avenues of investigation that the police can follow, still no arrests have been made. A few months after Lauren disappeared, the family suffered another tragedy when her mom, Laura, died. She contracted COVID while she was in the hospital fighting other infections. But Lauren's family actually finds some of the circumstances of her death suspicious. Like, Paul says that while Laura was in the hospital, the family held a fundraiser, a bike run for Lauren, and the same day, October 3rd, someone went to visit Laura in the hospital claiming to be Lauren's sister, Lindsay. But Lindsay was at the fundraiser, so it couldn't have been her who went to the hospital.
What?
Yeah. Now, Laura deteriorated after that and died on October 15, 2020.
And are the police looking into this at all? Like, that seems super sketchy.
I don't know. It's weird, though. Like, something that's just a little unsettling. The one-year anniversary of Lauren's disappearance came and went. And in October of 2021, the family thought that they might actually get some answers when human remains are found in nearby North Fort Myers. The Lee County Sheriff's Office said that it was possible that the remains were Lauren's, but after checking dental records, they determined that the remains were of a 36-year-old woman named Brianna Tennant. According to Link News, Brianna had never even been reported missing. Now, Lauren's case has gotten a lot of exposure. Dr. Phil even did a segment on her recently. Her family says that support from the community and the media has just been overwhelming. It's what's kept them going as they wait and hope with all their hearts for a resolution.
You know what the worst part is the not knowing. You know, there's no closure. I will never stop until I find out what happened and get justice for her. I'll never stop. That's what keeps me up most nights.
Paul is actually the one who reached out to us about his daughter's disappearance, just wanting to get the word out as much as possible, and we hope this helps in some way. At the time she went missing, Lauren was 29 years old. She was 5 feet tall, about 110 pounds. She's white and has light brown hair dyed blonde with brown roots and brown eyes. She has several tattoos, including the word Namaste on her right side, a symbol on her wrist, and an NY symbol on her pelvis. And she also has rosary beads tattooed on her ankle. We're going to put these numbers in our blog post for the episode, but if anyone has any information about Lauren, you can call the Cape Coral Police Department at 239-574-3223, or you can call Crime Stoppers anonymously at 1-800-780-TIPS. When you do, please reference the case number 20-011-323. There is a reward of up to $8,000 for information of her whereabouts. Now, Paul isn't the only family member of a victim who's reached out to us recently. Another person reached out, actually a fan of the show, to tell us about her mother's disappearance, which also happened in Florida. And we wanted to make sure that her story was heard too. So this Monday, we're giving you a bonus mini episode that you can listen to right now. If you or someone you know is a victim of domestic violence, help is available. The number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline is right in our show notes. It's 1-800-799-SAFE. You can visit crimejunkiepodcast.com to check out photos, documents, and source material for this week's episode.
And be sure to follow us on Instagram at Crime Junkie Podcast.
And we'll be back next week with another brand new episode. Crime Junkie is an Audio Chuck production. So, what do you think, Chuck? Do you approve? Hi, Crime Junkies. I'm your host, Ashley Flowers.
And I'm Britt.
And the story I have for you today is as infuriating as it is heartbreaking. When a 12-year-old girl is murdered in Northern California, everyone is quick to say she just fell through the cracks. But her story is so much bigger than that. And her case exposed the cracks in every system that failed her repeatedly, both while she was alive and after her death. Now, her sister is fighting for long overdue justice and trying to solve her murder. This is the story of Georgia Leah Moses. It's Friday, August 22nd, 1997 in Santa Rosa, California, and police officers and child protective services knock on the door of Edward Pope. They're there to conduct a welfare check because they've heard that Edward is living with his girlfriend, Ida Moses, and Ida's 7-year-old daughter, Angel. And that's a big problem because Edward, or Eddie as everyone calls him, is a convicted child molester. Having Angel living in his apartment is a huge violation of his parole.
Yeah.
So when they get there, it's Angel that the police want to speak with. She is the one who can tell them if Eddie has been abusing her. So they take her outside the apartment, away from Eddie and her mom, to ask her some questions. But Angel has something else that she wants to tell them. Something that, to her, is more important than anything they originally came there for. She tells them it's been over a week since she's seen her older sister, 12-year-old Georgia Moses, who is really more like a mom to her than a big sister. You see, their mom, Ida, had a rare condition called bipolar schizoaffective disorder, which is a combination of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia symptoms. And so she's not able to properly care for the girls. By the time she had turned 12, Georgia had taken on more responsibility than, honestly, many adults. She'd been raising her sister and literally running the household, shopping for groceries, doing laundry, making sure that bills were paid with Ida's social security checks, like you name it. And even though she'd been staying with various family friends for the last few months, Georgia still took it upon herself to make sure that her family was doing all right. So her not being by at all worried Angel.
So why wasn't she living with Ida and Angel?
Well, because of Eddie. Once Ida and Eddie started dating, he kind of unofficially moved in with her and her daughters, even though he had his own place. Georgia didn't like him and honestly tried to stay away from him. But one day in the spring of 1997, Eddie followed her into her room. Here's Georgia's sister Angel Turner, who spoke with our reporter Nina about this.
She got into an argument with him because he was trying to do something to her. And so he basically gave her the ultimatum of, if you're not going to do what I want, then you got to move out.
Now, shortly before this story started, where the cops started coming by to check on Angel, Ida had gotten evicted from her apartment. So she and Angel had moved into Eddie's place, the one that he still had in Santa Rosa. But even though Georgia didn't go with them, she still kept some of her stuff there. And she stopped by every single day to check on her sister and her mom. She would never just abandon them. But she hasn't been by in a while now, so Angel knows something is wrong. But the police talking to her are still so focused on Eddie and Angel. They keep pressing Angel about him. But as police try and question her, she keeps steering the conversation right back to Georgia. All she wants is to see her sister. But unfortunately, it's too late. That very same afternoon, in a city about 15 miles south of Santa Rosa called Petaluma, a California Department of Transportation worker named Glenn Hayes is out fixing a broken guardrail off Highway 101. According to the Petaluma Argus-Courier, Glenn is putting up a work sign next to this pine tree near an on-ramp when he sees something horrifying. Under the pine tree is the body of a girl. She is naked and badly decomposed. Georgia Moses has been found before authorities even knew that she was missing.
So she hadn't been reported missing by anyone?
No, this whole time that she wasn't coming around, Ida kind of figured that Georgia was with the family friends that she had been living with. The Sonoma County Sheriff's Office says that since Georgia hadn't been reported missing yet, there were no reports to match to that body they found. So Georgia isn't identified right away. Even after the autopsy is conducted on Monday, August 25th, police say that they still don't know who she is or even how she died. And actually, they think that she's a grown woman rather than a child. They tell the media that the person that was found is between the ages of 18 and 40.
What?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure how that happens. I guess it can be a lot harder to tell the age of someone, again, when that decomposition is severe. But to me, that's a huge difference in a 12-year-old girl.
And a huge range in general.
Based on the decomposition, the coroner estimates that this person had been dead for at least a week and possibly as long as a month before she was found. Now, as to how and when Georgia does officially get reported missing, there are a couple of conflicting stories. Now, we know that Angel told authorities on August 22nd that she hadn't seen her sister in ages, because that was when Child Protective Services confirmed that she was living with Eddie, who, again, wasn't allowed to live with children. That same day, CPS took her away from Ida and placed her in a children's group home. So one possibility is that Angel was the one who actually reported her sister missing. That maybe after she talked to police that day, they confirmed with Ida that Georgia hadn't been around for a while, and that prompted filing a missing persons report. Another story comes from a statement the sheriff's office posted on Facebook in 2021. They say that Georgia was only reported missing on August 25th after an anonymous tipster contacted a different police department, Santa Rosa Police, and told them that she had been missing for 2 weeks. That department took a report and issued a flyer to other local law enforcement agencies. And that's when a connection was made between Georgia and the body found 3 days earlier, and people were able to connect the dots. There's also a third scenario. In the coroner's report, it said that CPS made the missing persons report about Georgia to Santa Rosa police, and then Santa Rosa police spoke with Ida, Eddie, and Angel regarding possible child abuse at Eddie's apartment. But it doesn't say when those things happened. All it says is that police recontacted Ida and Eddie on August 25th, and Eddie told them Georgia had been missing since August 13th, and that they hadn't reported her missing to police.
Okay, so 2 of those scenarios sound like they didn't even acknowledge what Angel had said.
I mean, that's what it sounds like to me, too, and I don't get it.
Honestly, my head is spinning already.
We'll get used to it, honestly, because the conflicting details, the gaps in information, the multiple versions of what did and did not happen, these are running themes with this case, and it's hard to lay out one set timeline. But based on the sheriff's post, Georgia is identified on August 26th. This is 4 days after her body was found. According to Dateline NBC reporter Andrea Cavalier, her body is so badly decomposed that she had to be identified through dental records. But even with the decomposition where it was, the coroner was able to determine that Georgia's death was a homicide. She had been strangled. According to Petaluma Argus-Courier reporter Susan Lauer, Georgia had also been sexually assaulted. But unless I'm missing something, I actually can't find anything to corroborate that. And it's not a direct quote from the police, so I'm not sure where that information is coming from. It may have been an assumption based on the fact that Georgia was nude when she was found. And when we asked Angel about this, she told us that police have never officially said that Georgia was sexually assaulted. Like, there's apparently nothing in the autopsy about that, although her genitals were examined for DNA evidence. We also don't know exactly when Georgia was killed, but police say that it was sometime between the night of August 13th and the early morning of August 14th. So ultimately, the coroner lists her date of death as August 13th, 1997, which is the last confirmed day that anyone saw her alive. Angel remembers getting the news of her sister's death. She was in that group home that she'd been placed in. She was outside playing with her friends when one of the adults came outside and told her that they needed to speak with her. She didn't want to go inside. She was having fun. But the woman told her that it was serious. Police had found Georgia.
So I'm looking around like, okay, where is she? And she said, well, she's dead. They found her body. They had to use her dental records because her body was so decomposed. And I didn't know what that meant.
Now that it was clear to police that Angel's worries were completely founded, they got to work trying to retrace her last movement. They found that August 13th was like any other summer day for Georgia. She spent most of it hanging out with a friend who we're going to call Jessica, and they were hanging out at Jessica's family's house in Santa Rosa. According to the Press-Democrat, they did normal preteen stuff. You know, they talked on the phone, they listened to music, they drank lots of soda. And at some point, Georgia left Jessica's house and went to Eddie's apartment to check on Angel, just like usual. And then after that, the two of them, being Angel and Georgia, went out for a bit to a store, which was right around the corner, and then they headed back to Eddie's.
We were coming back to the house. It was already nighttime. There was a guy that approached us as we were walking. My sister stopped, talked to him. It was somebody we knew. I knew that much because it was familiar.
Now, this guy was a big guy, muscular and tall, and he was wearing a white shirt. Georgia told Angel to run ahead, which she did. But you know, typical little sister, all about what her big sister was doing. She looked over to see what was going on. Angel says Georgia handed the man her pager for a minute. It looked like he was trying to find her pager number, like looking through the info stored on it. And after that, Georgia rejoined Angel and they went back to the apartment. Georgia did Angel's hair, she got her settled in for the night, and Angel even begged her sister to stay.
I can't stay here. I'll be back. Take me with you. She's like, I can't. And then she kissed me goodnight and she left.
Georgia went back to Jessica's house and the police learned that someone paged her just before 10 p.m. She used Jessica's phone to return that call and arranged to meet a man at a nearby gas station at the intersection of Sebastopol Road and Dutton Avenue. Now, some of what we learn next actually wasn't known back in 1997. It's stuff that Angel has pieced together after years of her own investigations. But Georgia told Jessica that she was going to a party in Petaluma and invited her along. But Jessica's mom had told her she wasn't allowed to go, and Jessica didn't want to get in trouble, so she decided to stay behind. Jessica said that Georgia seemed apprehensive about going by herself, but Georgia also told her that there would be people there that she knew, so she wasn't going to see like a bunch of strangers. Jessica walked to the gas station with Georgia. And she says that she tried to talk Georgia actually out of going, but Georgia told her that she had to because she wanted to take care of her family.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, Angel believes that Georgia was actually being sex trafficked by a group of older friends. Like, this wasn't just like a hangout, party, 12-year-olds or even teenagers. She thinks that, again, she was being trafficked. Angel says that Georgia had began to change once she started hanging out with this group, right around her 12th birthday in January of 1997. She said she started acting and even dressing different. She was smoking cigarettes, she was smoking weed, and she even lost interest in dancing, which was like her favorite thing in the world to do before that.
My sister's mood had shifted completely from being this, happy person to being now sad and depressed. She had a lot of red flags that people just overlook.
Some of these so-called friends would apparently make regular trips to San Francisco to perform sex work, which they referred to as parties, and they would bring Georgia with them. And listen, we call it sex work for young women who were of age or are of age, but we know that a child can't be a sex worker. They cannot consent.
Right. So maybe the party Georgia was talking about was basically one of these sex parties?
So that's definitely the implication. So what we know is that night, Georgia got into a white four-door sedan. Jessica described the driver to police as a black man with a medium complexion who was maybe 25 to 30 years old, anywhere from 6'2" to 6'4", and about 200 pounds. She said he had very short, closely cropped black hair and a slight mustache. And based on this description of the driver, police work up a facial composite sketch. We actually have a copy of that on our blog post for this episode, but I'm going to have you take a look.
I mean, yeah, based on what you said, Jessica said, it's pretty on point. His eyes are kind of closely set together, maybe a little bit of a receding hairline, and I can't tell if it's the way his hair is drawn and the receding hairline, but his head almost looks a bit bulbous is the only word I can kind of think of. And yeah, a slight wispy little mustache. So was the driver the same guy that she and Angel ran into earlier that night?
Angel really isn't sure. All she remembers is that there was this familiar energy about the guy that she saw with her sister. She said she was even kind of excited to see him, but she can't remember who he was, so it's impossible to say if it's the same person. But she also doesn't think that the timing of their interaction and the pager exchange and the meetup that night is just a coincidence. Now, I do know that Jessica expected to see Georgia later that night because she was supposed to come back. And at some point, she might have called Jessica to say that she wouldn't be returning after all. I mean, honestly, it's not even clear if Georgia ever even made it to the party. We don't know where she went, who she was with, what she did. All we know is she got into that car and then her body was found 9 days later, nude under a tree by the highway. So in trying to find out what could have happened to Georgia, learning more about her background became necessary. Angel says that over the years, the girls were taken away from Ida on at least 3 different occasions that she can remember. Ida had even reached out to CPS herself a couple of times, listen, I'm not able to care for these children. She wanted her daughters to have a chance at a better life, and at the time, she just wasn't in a position to give that to them. But CPS would always end up returning Georgia and Angel to their mother. And if there ever was a need and a time for CPS to intervene, it was 1997. Not only was Ida dating Eddie Pope, but like Georgia, Ida was also hanging out with a new crowd. She was spending more and more time with this new group of people, some local families who all knew each other. There was actually some overlap in the group. Some of Georgia's new older friends were also connected to the people that Ida socialized with, and all of these people had a bad effect on both mother and daughter. Throughout 1997, Ida's mental health got progressively worse. In fact, she deteriorated so rapidly that Angel is convinced that her mother was being drugged. And I guess it would be one thing if, no one outside of the family knew that something was wrong, but Angel says that the Sonoma County District Attorney's Office learned about Eddie's involvement with the family as early as April of that year. So she doesn't know why they didn't take action then. All she knows is that they didn't knock on Eddie's door until August 22nd. So instead of getting help, basically all that happened was Georgia got kicked out and was staying with various people. She stayed a lot with this one woman, one of the people that Ida had been spending time with. The woman was Ida's home health care aide, and Angel says that the house she lived in was basically a crack house where adults did drugs and the kids were pretty much on their own. And even when she bounced around, every house that Georgia stayed at had one thing in common: a lack of parental supervision. So by late spring of 1997, Georgia's grades had dropped a lot because she was barely going to school. Angel says that by the end of that school year, administrators told Georgia that she would have to repeat the 6th grade, but Georgia had other concerns on her mind.
She told them that she wasn't coming back because she'd take care of her family.
Did the school do some sort of intervention of any kind?
Well, you would think that when a 12-year-old just stops going to school, maybe that would prompt some sort of action on the school's part.
Yeah.
Mandated reporters are required to, report suspected neglect and abuse to law enforcement or social services. But once again, Angel says that there was no indication that anything was ever done. No intervention, no reports to the agency of any kind, and no record that the school officials ever even discussed any of this with Georgia's mother.
What the actual
Trent Taylor, who was director principal at the Mountain Shadow Middle School, told the Press Democrat reporter Peter Blumberg that Georgia abruptly stopped coming to school in early May of 1997. And he also said, quote, "We had heard she was living with a cousin, but we couldn't track these things. Her grades were unfortunately reflective of a student who had a lot of needs," end quote.
Okay, unfortunately, she may have had a lot of needs, and no one in the school system was like, "Hey, we should help this girl." What?
Yeah, it seems like he's using that as an excuse of yeah, she just had a lot of needs, and so
we couldn't help her. You're the school.
Yeah, all the more reason. Yes.
Oh, okay, you're gonna have to go on because I will just rage spiral on this.
Now, even with all this going on, by July of 1997, so just a month before Georgia's murder, things actually were looking up for the Moses family. Ida was making plans to move back to her hometown of Buffalo, New York with the girls. Georgia and Angel were actually both born there, and their 2 older brothers still lived there. They actually hadn't moved out west with Ida and the girls. So everyone was looking forward to reuniting, but Georgia was especially excited. She couldn't wait to spend more time with her brothers, to see her nieces and nephews. This would actually be a chance for a fresh start for all of them, and she was ready to go. But then Ida's purse got stolen. And you know how it is when your whole life is in your purse. Everything Ida had was in there: her ID, her social security card, money, everything. And Angel doesn't think that this was a coincidence or just a simple theft. She thinks it was a calculated move to keep her family, mainly Georgia, from leaving the area.
Even in her state of, deterioration, she was not careless about her purse. She didn't have anything else. She had her purse. So for us to be so close to leaving, and then out of all the times my mom's purse to get stolen, somebody wanted us to stay.
If the stolen purse was part of a plan to stop them from leaving, it worked. The move to New York was put on hold, and then Georgia went missing. Now, in the weeks that follow the discovery of Georgia's body, the case goes a little differently than you'd expect. With no leads, you'd kind of expect the police to lean on the media, get people talking. But the majority of the local news coverage is not what you'd expect.
What do you mean?
Well, from the beginning, there was a narrative built around Georgia that she was a troubled kid with a bleak future, and honestly, she was pretty much blamed for her own death. One article says that she was, quote, playing with fire. And in another article, Ida's boyfriend Eddie is quoted describing Georgia as a troublemaker.
So, just to be clear, they're letting this guy, who I assume they already know was a convicted child molester, create the narrative and story about who Georgia was?
Yeah, and by the way, this isn't something that just looks bad today just because we know better. Even while this was unfolding, some community members are vocally critical about how the media is portraying Georgia and about how little coverage her case is getting compared to others. And Petaluma, of all communities, knows exactly what the coverage for Georgia should look like because they've seen it firsthand. Just a few years before, in '93, a 12-year-old girl in the same area named Polly Klass was abducted from her bedroom during a slumber party and murdered. And the media coverage for her case is night and day compared to Georgia's.
Right, but we see that all the time, the way some victims get attention and others don't.
Yeah, again, it's truly like the most like stark comparison. You can't even say that poly class came after and they learned better. Like, this is truly the best example of how someone's class plays into how people treat their disappearance or murder or whatever. Now, Georgia's family can't afford a funeral, so members of the local community come together to hold a memorial service. According to San Francisco Chronicle reporter George Snyder, mourners packed the Santa Rosa Community Baptist Church in October of 1997 to say goodbye to Georgia. Her friends and classmates cry as they share stories and talk about how much they loved her. Now, what most people don't realize is that the casket in the church is empty. Investigators haven't released Georgia's body yet because they're still doing forensic testing. Even though she had been identified, because of that level of decomposition, it's taking them longer to do a more detailed analysis of her body parts to confirm things like height and age and race, which, I mean, again, we know who she is. I don't fully understand this part, but they're keeping it for whatever reason. So it's not until June of 1998 that Georgia is actually buried. Her family isn't at the second funeral because by the time it takes place, Angel and Ida had moved to the state of Georgia, and they're living with Angel's aunt. Fast forward to November of 98, police think that they have a decent lead when a truck driver named Wayne Adam Ford, who has ties to Petaluma, confesses to murdering 4 women. According to the Petaluma Argus-Courier, Sonoma County officials had also linked Wayne to the brutal assault of a sex worker in Santa Rosa earlier that year. But after police interview him, they're convinced that he didn't have anything to do with Georgia's murder. On the 2-year anniversary of the day that Georgia was last seen, the Press Democrat interviews Sheriff's Detective Russ Davidson, who's leading the investigation. Detective Davidson says, quote, "This case is still active and very much open. There's $15,000 in rewards offered. We'd still very much like to talk to the man in the white car," end quote. But in the coming months, there are no updates about additional tips that come in and the case stalls again. A couple of years later, another potential suspect emerges. A former Petaluma substitute teacher named Carr. According to the Los Angeles Times, they were obsessed with the kidnapping and murder of Polly's class. And their conversations about Polly were suspicious enough that police actually searched their home in 2001 in connection with Georgia's murder. During the search, they find sexually explicit photos of children on the household computer, which results in Carr getting charged for, quote, child pornography possession. But before police can make an arrest, they flee to Thailand. But a few years later in 2006, this person pops back up in connection with a whole nother high-profile child murder case. They were the one who's actually arrested for confessing to kill JonBenet Ramsey. But by then, they actually had been cleared in Georgia's case, and their confession about JonBenet turns out to be false. Eventually, even those charges that they were facing regarding the child sex abuse material were dismissed because, according to the San Francisco Chronicle, prosecutors can't show when the computer was actually used. And in case that wasn't complicated enough for you, the computer was actually lost when the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office moved its headquarters. Apparently, it was the only item among 175,000 pieces of evidence that went missing.
Okay, I have a lot of questions, but obviously that was kind of a rabbit hole in this case. So what about someone like Eddie Pope? To me, he seems like the obvious choice for a potential suspect based on his history.
Totally, but Angel says that police told her that Eddie had an alibi and he was cleared. So, again, people pop up, they get cleared, years pass, and the case is ice cold. In the time since her sister's murder, Angel grows up, she joined the military, she has a family and settles down in Texas. She reaches out to police a couple of times to see if they're making any progress on her sister's case, but those conversations really don't go anywhere. Angel says that she's basically told by the police that they don't have any new information, that when they get new information, they'll let her know, and that honestly her calling them isn't going to create new information.
Which I get, but it's so frustrating to imagine hearing.
Yeah, like, the least you can do is take my call twice a year.
Yeah, like, I'm doing everything I can, and all I can do is call, let me have this one thing.
And also, again, I call BS because it's the cases where, like, the families don't give up, where you're making the calls over and over, that once you have resources and you're deciding what cases get attention, I promise you, those are the ones that do.
Right, the squeaky wheel cases. And I also think about how many times that we've seen cases where there has been progress in the case, there have been updates, and no one is told, and no one is notified.
Oh, yeah, and, like, the family finds out on the news?
Exactly, like, I'm sorry, guys. Keep making the calls. That's my unofficial endorsement.
100%. But listen, even with this statement, even though like, hey, don't call us, we'll call you, honestly, at this point, Angel was trusting that the police are hard at work. She figures that if the case is unsolved, it's because it can't be solved, not because nothing is being done to solve it. Now, she also Googles the case from time to time, trying to find out if there are any new developments. But she honestly can't stand to read the news stories about her sister, because most of the articles she sees, and again, they're few and far between, they all have the same victim-blaming tone. Although Angel is happy to learn that a woman named Leah Rowley founded a home for neglected and abused children in Georgia's memory. Even though it lost funding and had to be shut down, Angel was touched to know that people are thinking of her sister because she herself never stopped thinking about her. And by 2019, her thoughts are really going into overdrive. Every missing person or child murder case that she hears about is a major trigger. She starts to poke around more online. She even joins a Facebook group that had been created for Georgia. And that's when she realizes that people back in Petaluma and Northern California had made efforts over the years to bring attention to the case, but they just weren't having much luck. So Angel does what no family member should have to do, but what we see all too often is necessary. She starts her own investigation, finding out what she can about the people that she, Georgia, and her family were close with back around the time of the murder. And she also starts pushing police to be more active. And we're not exactly sure when police stopped considering Georgia's case active, but by the time Angel starts reaching out, there's no detective assigned to the case. That actually changes, though, in the fall of 2020. At the time, Angel thinks that this means she's going to start getting some answers, but she's still met with a lot of the same resistance she dealt with over the years.
They did some footwork, but it was like whatever was easy for them to do.
It's right around this time, and totally out of the blue, that Angel gets an email from a woman named Maria Martin. Maria grew up in Sonoma County, and Georgia's case had been on her mind for years. She didn't know Georgia, but they actually went to the same school. And her dad was actually a deputy with the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office at the time of Georgia's murder, although he retired soon after. After she and Angel connect, Maria starts helping Angel with her investigation, and the two of them decide to launch a podcast. They called her Georgia Lee, which you guys should definitely check out for a super deep dive on the case. The podcast is their chance to tell Georgia's real story, the way Angel felt like it should have always been told. And the more they find out, the more they start thinking that Georgia's case was never a top priority for law enforcement. Maria says police made a mistake in the very beginning that set the stage for everything that followed.
Here is the first and most significant injustice that just paved the way for the rest of it. The thing that sort of shaped this entire investigation, they didn't even get the name right. That was the defining moment that emphasized how little care was taken throughout the entire investigation.
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, for years, Georgia Leah Moses was called Georgia Lee Moses. And this wasn't just in the media, but police records, her death certificate, even her gravestone. Even Angel didn't know that Georgia's middle name was Leah until recently.
How does this even happen?
And there's not a simple answer, and I mean, we can get into some more detail later, but for now, I'll tell you how it all started. Police apparently got the information from a relative who wasn't telling the truth. Why? I have no idea. But no one ever bothered to ask Ida, who, despite her mental health issues, knows exactly what her daughter's name is. And no one ever bothered to double-check Georgia's birth certificate or her school records, both of which did say Leah. So that was the first mistake, but Angel and Maria say it was far from the last. They say police failed to follow up on certain leads, and they didn't communicate with the family or share accurate information with the community. Now, a sergeant with the sheriff's office told Dateline NBC that police have followed up on each and every lead, and they want to solve the murder for Georgia and her family. And on their Facebook post about Georgia, the sheriff's office says that they never gave up on her, even though no progress was made in the case back in 1997. They say that they do their best to find justice for every violent crime victim and their families. I can give you an example of what Angel and Maria are talking about. One of Georgia's friends thought that the composite sketch looked just like her mom's ex-boyfriend, a firefighter from San Francisco. And she's not just naming a guy like randomly out of thin air. The firefighter knew Georgia. They had given her rides home from her friend's house. he had access to a white four-door car. It was his girlfriend's Honda. And Angel says that this guy had a reputation for acting inappropriately with young girls. So the friend went to speak with police, but maybe because she was young or had a juvenile record, Angel and Maria say that she wasn't taken seriously. In fact, the officer she spoke with apparently asked her if she was sharing her suspicions because she was mad about the way the firefighter treated her mother.
So they thought she was just like spite reporting this guy.
Yeah, basically. The friend's mother, who had actually dated the guy, also spoke with police about him, and a family friend of theirs made an anonymous tip about him because she remembered seeing him with Georgia at times. So we've got 3 different statements on one person, but Angel says that police didn't take reports on any of those statements. When she asked the detective about the guy, Angel found out that he wasn't even on their radar. The friend had to give another statement to police, like some 20 plus years after she gave the first one.
I mean, yeah, I was gonna ask, did they ever even find out who the guy in the white car was?
Well, I mean, the short answer is, I don't know. But again, there are multiple stories. Because according to a Press Democrat article, police believe the man driving the car was someone Georgia had met up with occasionally in the past, and he might have been from San Francisco. Angel was told by police that they did interview a person of interest who they thought was the guy in the sketch, but he apparently wasn't under suspicion anymore. And in that news release post from the sheriff's office last year, police say that they've never been able to identify the man, and he's still a person of interest. But there are some other strong possibilities. Angel and Maria both think that Georgia's older group of friends is involved in some way, considering the predatory nature of the relationships and the fact that there was, in all likelihood, sex trafficking going on.
Just knowing how predators work, like they oversee a lot of what you're doing. So even if my sister went somewhere, people are keeping tabs on her.
Members of that group mentioned separately that they were supposed to hang out with Georgia that night, but she never showed up. Plus, some of these friends were super vocal after Georgia's death, like talking about how much they missed her and stuff. But they haven't been very helpful more recently, when Angel reached out to them with questions about her sister's murder and everything that led up to it.
Now that we're trying to get the answers and we're getting closer, the people that knew what was going on the last days of her life, they're quiet. They're hiding.
Maria also thinks there's another possibility. There was a man who lived near Georgia's friend Jessica's family. This guy was heavy on police's radar in the case with good reason. In the 1960s, he was arrested for raping a teenager. In the 1970s, he was convicted of murder after he admitted to sexually assaulting and strangling a woman. And according to California sex offender records, he is currently in prison for, quote, continuous sexual abuse of a child, end quote. Now, this man is white, so he's not the man that Georgia got in the car with that night. But he lived right near Jessica, and he was really close with Jessica's family, which would have given him access to Georgia. And he apparently, freaked out when police questioned him about Georgia, although I'm not sure when exactly that took place.
Has he been mentioned in any news coverage about Georgia's case?
No, not that I could find. It seemed like Angel and Maria found out about police looking into him years after the fact. And listen, the two of them have been working really hard to find out the truth. And by the way, I don't know if I said this earlier, it actually wasn't until after their work began that they found out about Georgia's middle name not being Lee. They ended up keeping the name Lee on the website that they made, on the social media pages, because they had already started to build up so much momentum. That's honestly what people have gotten to know Georgia as, is Georgia Lee. So if you start Googling, you might see a discrepancy, but that's why. Truthfully, the discovery was devastating to Angel. You see, Angel's middle name is Lee, and she figured that she and her sister had the same middle name. The worst part about all of that is, Maria says that police never took ownership of that mistake.
Blame shifted right back onto their family. Oh, well, they could have reached out at any point in the last 24 years. I'm sorry, your office has a birth certificate and a death certificate that don't match. That is on you. That is not at all on the family.
But there were reasons that the family didn't reach out. Ida was struggling with her mental health, and there was a long period of time when Angel and her older brothers, who did know Georgia's middle name was Leah, were estranged. So there was a lack of communication within the family, and they weren't comparing notes. So it was only after Angel and one of her older brothers reconnected that she learned the truth. Her brother saw people posting on social media about Georgia with the name Lee, but he just figured that it was like those people who were making the mistake.
Right, and like he's not gonna call the sheriff's office and be like, hey, someone on the internet is using the wrong name for my sister, or maybe it's a typo, I don't know.
Yeah, he didn't think police had the information wrong, or that Georgia's gravestone even had the information wrong. And some people have told Angel to basically, like, get over it. Like, so what? It's just a middle name. Focus on finding the killer. But you're talking about the key part of someone's identity. And again, to go back to this whole thing, like, if you can't even get the name right, like, I'm pretty sure some other stuff is done wrong here. Yeah. And another frustrating part about that is, again, this, as Angel has done so much work to publicize her sister's case, to find out that you did all of that and are not technically publishing like the right name is so frustrating, because it's one of those things that you have to try and go back and undo and now explain to people, and that's just, it's exhausting when, again, someone just didn't do the work in the first place.
I would say it's not the same, but we altered the spelling of our son's name when we adopted him. But the process of even just like going to the school, going to the doctors, going to the dentist, and making sure that like the slight spelling differentiation is official now was a nightmare. I can't imagine doing this decades down the line.
And trying to tell the world, right? Like, how many thousands or millions of people have heard George's name?
Well, and like not just to like make sure records are straight, but to help solve your sister's murder.
Like, stakes are high.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Now, again, what really frustrates me, you want to talk about, we had said earlier that they don't feel like the sheriff's office is taking a lack of ownership about that mistake. Mm-hmm. Well, the sheriff's Facebook post about Georgia last year still referred to her as Georgia Lee Moses. And to this day, it has not been updated or corrected, which, to me, easiest first step in trying to make this right.
Yeah, it's literally the least they could do.
You can edit the post. You don't have to delete the post, or delete the post and repost it.
Yeah, they've got those little 3 dots. You can drop down, edit. No one will ever know or remember.
Yeah, and not changing it, not changing something that we are all so 100% in agreement on, like, that this is wrong. It honestly feels like a slap in the face. Like, if you can't even admit that that's wrong and give her the dignity of the correct name, how are you looking at this investigation as a whole?
Well, I was going to say, if the Facebook post is wrong, that means that their records haven't been changed. Like, the missing persons report from decades ago hasn't been altered with a new name. Her murder case file hasn't been altered with a correct name. Like,
right, and honestly, I don't know the process for that. Maybe you can't go back, because again, maybe once it's on paper, it has to stay that way, and they updated a report, or I don't know what's happening behind the scenes.
There has to be a way to update the report.
Again, don't even talk about what happened behind the scenes. Like, my whole thing, though, is, like, if you're truly trying to get her name out there now...
Use the right one.
Use the right one. At least in what's public-facing. Like, I don't know. But there's also another big thing that, like, I can't wrap my head around either. So the sheriff's office also says there's a reward of $2,500 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of anyone responsible for Georgia's murder. But that's not the $15,000 that's been mentioned over the years in multiple news articles.
What? What happened to all that money?
Not a clue. Angel says that she asked the sheriff's office about the reward when she started contacting them a lot in 2020 because, I mean, she figured this is a pretty good incentive for people to share information and find the killer.
Right.
Now, she says that someone in the department confirmed that $15,000 amount to her. But after the new detective was assigned, Angel mentioned it to him, and he didn't know what she was talking about. People were even asking about it in the comment section on the sheriff's Facebook post. And the department's response was that they don't raise money or manage the reward funds, and that rewards are offered and paid by other people or other groups. They say that the $2,500 is offered by the Sonoma County Alliance Community Engagement and Safety Rewards Fund. But I don't know what other people or groups they're talking about. And so, did that money never exist?
Did someone like pull out of an agreement? Like, I have so many questions.
Yeah. And I've seen instances before where, like, there are time limits on rewards where, like, people will basically, like, say, hey, if someone comes forward, I'll put this money up for so long, but they don't want to be, like, contingent for that forever and ever. I don't know, but it's weird that no one can say what happened, right?
I would say, and you, again, like, you would expect to see some sort of record of that, like, expiration date or something somewhere.
Yeah, now Angel is offering a reward of her own for information that leads to the arrest and conviction of her sister's murderer or murderers. And the total reward, which now includes that $2,500 the sheriff's office mentioned, is now $25,000. Now, we're going to put that in the show notes, but if you have information about Georgia's murder, please call the sheriff's office at 707-565-2185. Or you can even submit a tip or send an email. We're going to have both of those links and email addresses in our show notes. Angel just wants her sister to have the justice she deserves, but that doesn't only mean her murder conviction. Justice for Georgia Leah Moses is also honoring and restoring her legacy and sharing the true story of who she was.
She was just a free-spirited kid that just had way more burdens than she needed to have. She literally was like years ahead of her time as far as